Chapter 36:26. Sinister Intentions. Nie Tian could not help but frown when he heard Ing Chongfeng's words, and his heart sank. He knew it would not be that simple. Everyone was stunned after hearing Ing Chongfeng's words. They could not react for a long time as they tried to guess what Ing Chongfeng meant. Could it be that Ing Chongfeng wanted Nie Tian, the dominator of the sky, to participate in the heaven and earth duel? The heaven and earth duel was a battle of life and death. After all, Nie Tian was the dominator of the sky, so it did not seem appropriate for him to participate in such a duel. Ing Sangxiong, who was standing aside, was dumbfounded. He was so shocked that he could not speak a word. "Does this mean that the universe and the sword is specially prepared for me?" asked Nie Tian as he stared at Ing Chongfeng with a smirk. He was much calmer at that moment. "That's right," Ing Chongfeng replied loudly with a faint smile. Everyone's eyes trembled violently as they were extremely shocked. Ing Chongfeng really wanted Nie Tian to participate in a universe duel. What if something happened to Nie Tian? How would Ing Chongfeng explain it to the other four forces? In everyone's opinion, Ing Chongfeng's action was extremely inappropriate. Although most people did not acknowledge Nie Tian's identity as the dominator of the sky, no one had thought of getting rid of Nie Tian. Dominator of the sky, I don't think I need to explain to you what the universe and the sword is. Ing Chongfeng smirked coldly. He had already seen Ing Sangxiong talking to Nie Tian. No need. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He looked calm and did not panic at all. Very well. Ing Chongfeng's lips twitched and a trace of darkness flashed across his eyes. Dominator of the sky, are you willing to participate in the universe in the sword? Do I have a choice? Nie Tian smiled faintly and asked. Of course. Ing Chongfeng chuckled and said, Is a swordsman who doesn't even dare to enter the sword universe really qualified to be the Lord of the Sky? Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his face darkened. He did not expect Ing Chongfeng to be so straightforward. Ing Chongfeng's words were very clear. If Nie Tian didn't enter the Cosmos Sword, the Chinquan sect would never recognize Nie Tian as the master of the sky. It was obvious that Ing Chongfeng had planned everything. If Nie Tian were to enter the universe in the sword, that would be what he wanted to see the most. If Nie Tian didn't enter, he would lose face in front of all the swordsmen in the Chinquan sect. Then his title as the Lord of the Sky would really be just a title. Even if he became stronger in the future, today's cowardice would be a shame that he would never be able to erase in his life. One had to admit that Ing Chongfeng's intentions were extremely sinister. At that moment, the way the crowd looked at Nie Tian slowly changed. There was contempt, meaning, and sympathy in their eyes. Anyone who was slightly smarter could tell that the Cosmos Sword was a trap that Ing Chongfeng had set for Nie Tian. Nie Tian had no choice but to jump into the trap. Otherwise, his title as the Lord of the Sky would only exist in name. So, Lord of the Sky, what's your answer? Ing Chongfeng asked with a cold smile when he noticed that Nie Tian had not spoken for a long time. He was obviously impatient. At that moment, Ing Chongfeng finally revealed his true self. He was like an actor who had removed his disguise and revealed his true self. Nie Tian. Ing Sangxiong called out to Nie Tian at that moment and shook his head continuously. It was obvious that he was reminding Nie Tian not to agree to it. Ing Sangxiong knew how terrifying the Cosmos Sword was. He did not want Nie Tian to be in danger. Who's my opponent? Nie Tian smiled faintly and asked Ing Chongfeng in a deep voice. Nie Tian, you're the Lord of the Sky and a peerless sword principal genius recognized by the heart of the sky. The corner of Ing Chongfeng's mouth twitched as he said with a smile, Your opponent must be the most outstanding disciple of the Chinquan sect. Zhu Zia? Or Ing Longshao? Nie Tian narrowed his eyes and asked directly. Zia, Longshao. Ing Chongfeng did not answer directly. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched into a cold arc as he let out a strange laugh. Yes. Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao answered at the same time and took a step forward. They looked at each other before looking at Nie Tian and said in a loud voice, I wonder if we, the Chinquan sect, are qualified to be the Lord of the Sky's opponent if we join forces. Nie Tian looked at Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao. When he heard their words, his pupils involuntarily shrunk, and his face instantly became incomparably gloomy. He never thought that Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao would actually join forces to fight against him. Everyone's expression also changed as they gasped one after another. They were speechless for a long time. In everyone's opinion, whether it was Zhu Zia or Ying Longshao, it was impossible for Nie Tian to win. After all, his strength was too weak. However, what Ying Changfeng did was to let Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao join forces to fight against Nie Tian alone. Ying Changfeng was really too sinister. On the surface, he raised Nie Tian's status so high, but in reality, he could not wait to kill him and use sinister methods to deal with him. Nie Tian smiled bitterly. His gaze swept across Ying Changfeng's body and could not help but shake his head. Who would have thought that the dignified Heaven and Earth Gate Master was actually so despicable? Moreover, he was despicable to the point of being righteous. Lord Master of the Sky, are you satisfied with the opponents that this Gate Master has arranged for you? Ying Changfeng smiled sinisterly and looked at Nie Tian from afar. Satisfied? Very satisfied. Nie Tian had a cold and solemn face as he laughed lowly twice. As long as you're satisfied. Ying Changfeng smiled faintly with a gloomy face. At this time, everyone looked at Nie Tian with blazing eyes. They were all guessing in their hearts whether Nie Tian would participate in the universe in the sword. Nie Tian. Ying Sanxiong looked at Nie Tian and shouted again. He shook his head forcefully and did not let Nie Tian agree. Not participating in the universe in the sword would only be a matter of losing face. But participating in the universe in the sword would become a matter of life and death. Between the two, ordinary people could distinguish which was more important at a glance. However, Nie Tian remained silent for a long time before the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He looked at Ying Changfeng and said in a loud voice, "Since Lord Sectmaster has invited me with great hospitality, wouldn't it be a waste of Lord Sectmaster's good intentions if I don't attend? The universe in the sword is a battle between heaven and earth. I'll participate." The sonorous voice caused the entire place to fall into a dead silence. Everyone looked at Nie Tian in a daze and did not react for a long time. It was unbelievable that Nie Tian actually agreed to participate in the universe in the sword. Lord Master of the Sky is indeed bold. Ying Changfeng's eyes trembled with blazing excitement. He was also stunned for a long time before he reacted and laughed heartily. Chapter 36-27. The show has begun. Request? Ying Changfeng was startled for a moment before he smiled and said, "Master of the Sky, please speak." He was curious about what request Nie Tian would make. "I'm fighting Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao by myself. Don't you think it's unfair, Sect Master?" Nie Tian said loudly with a faint smile. Ying Changfeng frowned, and his expression stiffened. He did not expect Nie Tian to care about this. He could not help but laugh and said, "2 against 1. It's indeed unfair. Then let's do it this way. Master of the Sky, if any swordsman here has the honor to fight alongside the Master of the Sky, please invite him or her out." It didn't seem fair for Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao to join hands against Nie Tian. However, this was not the main point. The main point was that Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were the most powerful among the younger generation of swordsmen in the Qinquan sect. In other words, none of the remaining swordsmen could be Nie Tian's teammates. If he chose a weak swordsman, not only would he not be able to help Nie Tian, but he would also be a burden. If he had to choose a teammate from this group, Ying Sanxiong would be a good choice. Who is willing to stand still and be my teammate? At this moment, Nie Tian smiled and swept his gaze across the crowd as he spoke loudly. However, wherever he looked, everyone lowered their heads. It was obvious that they did not want to be his teammate. Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were too powerful. Under the current situation, whoever fought against Nie Tian would be courting death. Is there no one? The corner of Nie Tian's lips twitched. He smiled faintly, and his eyes were filled with undisguised mockery. If he did not agree to participate in the universe in the sword, these swordsmen would definitely look down on him. However, he wanted to find a teammate now, but no one stood out. At this moment, every sentence that Nie Tian said was also a mockery to these swordsmen. Ing Sanxiong looked at Nie Tian with a serious expression. He was hesitating whether he should step forward or not. He wasn't afraid of death, but he was afraid of being a burden to Nie Tian. He knew that his sword intent was not as strong as Nie Tian's. When two swordsmen worked together, they had to be at least of equal strength to achieve the effect of 1 + 1 is greater than 2. Moreover, in the sword universe, the sword formation was very sensitive to the swordsman's sword intent. Ing Sanxiong's strength had skyrocketed not long ago, causing his control over his martial body and his own sword intent to decrease a lot. It was really difficult for him to cooperate with Nie Tian. Me. After hesitating for a long time, Ing Sanxiong stood out and said loudly. Even if his strength was inferior to Nie Tian's, he felt extremely honored to be able to fight alongside Nie Tian. Ing Sanxiong. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned when they heard Ing Sanxiong's voice. They looked over and exclaimed. No one had expected that Ing Sanxiong would actually stand out at this moment. Was he not afraid of death? Ing Changfeng also frowned at this moment. He was obviously a little unhappy. Ing Sanxiong was at least top 5 among the younger generation of swordsmen in the Qinkuan sect. It would be a pity if he participated in the sword universe with Nie Tian. However, it was nothing. Losing Ing Sanxiong in exchange for the thing in Nie Tian's body was worth it. Brother Ing, I'll remember your kindness today for the rest of my life. However, our sword intents don't match. Let the person behind you do it. Nie Tian looked at Ing Sanxiong and said with a smile. Ing Sanxiong frowned. He suddenly turned around and saw Lan Zhuiying standing behind him. Let me do it. Lan Zhuiying looked at Ing Sanxiong. Her beautiful eyes flickered and she smiled faintly. She was already prepared. She just didn't stand out. Ing Changfeng looked at Lan Zhuiying and couldn't help but be stunned. Then he smiled and said, The Lord of the Sky really has a good eye. You chose a sword spirit body. Ing Changfeng only carefully observed Lan Zhuiying after Nie Tian chose her. Before that, he actually didn't realize that Lan Zhuiying was an extremely rare sword spirit body. Of course, after him, a swordsman with a sword spirit body had the sword intent of heaven and earth in his bloodline. Even his entire martial body was filled with the sword intent of heaven and earth. And a swordsman with a sword spirit body had the sword intent of heaven and earth. The sword universe was also filled with the sword intent of heaven and earth. A swordsman with a sword spirit body in the sword universe, under the same level of sword intent, would be able to stimulate the power of the sword formation by several times more than a normal swordsman. What worried Ing Changfeng even more was that although Lan Zhuiying was young, her swordsmanship had already reached the second heaven of the Oracle realm. A sword spirit martial artist at such a realm might bring some different variables to this heaven and earth showdown. She's my friend. I can choose her, right? Nie Tian asked calmly with a faint smile. Of course. Ing Changfeng smiled stiffly. He just said that Nie Tian could choose any swordsman present, including Lan Zhuiying. If he went back on his words, it would be like slapping himself in the face. Okay. Nie Tian nodded with a casual smile on his face. The reason why he chose Lan Zhuiying was that she had a sword spirit body. Lan Zhuiying would be the key to his victory in this heaven and earth showdown. Since that's the case, let's begin. Ing Changfeng looked at Nie Tian and let out a faint smile. His eyes shone with a cold light. Even if Nie Tian had the help of the sword spirit body, he absolutely did not believe that Nie Tian could win this heaven and earth showdown. Nie Tian nodded slightly and then looked at Lan Zhuiying. The two moved at the same time and directly stepped into the sword in the universe. Their figures appeared in the Kuan sword. At the same time, Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao appeared in the Qian sword. The heaven and earth showdown, the battle of heaven and earth. The four people would use the Qian sword and the Kuan sword as their weapons to carry out a cruel showdown. Boom! Boom! At the moment when the four people landed, the Qian Kuan double swords sensed a strong sword essence aura and suddenly shook in the void. releasing 2 boundless sword essence aura. 2 ripples of sword essence appeared between heaven and earth, sweeping in all directions with great power. What a strong aura! Everyone's eyes suddenly trembled and their expressions changed at the same time. They could not help but exclaim. They did not expect that the sword essence aura released by the Qiankuan double swords would be so terrifying. The stronger the sword essence aura of the Qiankuan double swords, the stronger the sword essence of Nietian and the other 3 people. The show is about to start. Ying Changfeng stood high in the sky and looked at Nietian and the others. The corner of his mouth twitched and his face darkened. It was the first time that Nietian and Lan Zhuiying had entered the universe in the sword, so they were completely unfamiliar with the surrounding formation aura. They needed some time to adapt to the sword formation power of the Kuan sword. Chapter 36:28. Chapter 36:23. Battle of Heaven and Earth. Boom! Ying Longxiao's sword was released wildly. The giant Qian sword soared into the sky like a giant dragon. A terrifying sword aura was released, and the brilliance of the sword surged tens of thousands of meters away. The heaven and earth trembled as if it was about to collapse. Huh? Nietian's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't expect Ying Longxiao to attack directly. It seemed that Ying Longxiao was very familiar with the universe in the sword. He must have trained for a long time in advance. Ying Changfeng was despicable to this extent. Since he had already decided to let Ying Longxiao participate in the universe duel, it was not strange for him to familiarize himself with the universe and the sword in advance. Boom! At this moment, after the Qian sword soared into the sky, it suddenly swooped down and directly attacked the Kuan sword. Watch out! Lan Zhuiying's expression suddenly changed. Her beautiful eyes couldn't help but tremble as she screamed. She could feel the terrifying impact of the sword aura in the Kuan sword. She didn't expect the battle of the universe and the sword to be so terrifying. Nietian's eyes narrowed, and his face instantly became tense. Then, the sword will surged wildly from his body and attacked the Kuan sword. Boom! In the next moment, the Kuan sword sensed something and soared into the sky. The heaven and earth shook, and the clouds changed color. It was extremely terrifying. Huh? Ying Changfeng's expression suddenly changed when he saw this. He couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. He couldn't believe his eyes. Nietian had just entered the Kuan sword, and he could actually activate the Kuan sword with his sword will. Under normal circumstances, even a monster swordsman would need a long time to adapt and activate the Qian sword or the Kuan sword. However, Nietian could directly activate the Kuan sword with his sword will. It was too terrifying. As for Ying Longxiao, he had already adapted to the universe in the sword in advance, so he could activate the Qian sword immediately. Even Zhu Zia couldn't directly activate the Qian sword and could only move along with Ying Longxiao. Boom! In the next moment, the 2 swords collided with a terrifying sound in the void. The heaven and earth were solemn because of it. Then, an incomparably powerful force was released and rushed in all directions. It was like a surging wave, stirring up the heaven and earth, as if it was going to annihilate everything. The crowd looked at the 2 sword shadows in the sky with trembling eyes and retreated. No one had expected that the battle would break out in an instant, and that it would be so intense. Boom! At that moment, an explosive rumble rang out. The Kuan sword was like a huge beast, flying tens of thousands of meters away in the void. Tremendous sword chi swept through everything, and the world seemed like it was going to collapse. Pooh! Almost at the same time, Nietian and Lan Zhuiying's bodies trembled at the same time. They spat out a mouthful of blood, and their faces became extremely pale. Nietian forcibly stabilized his body. The sword in tin around him continued to be released, and only then did he stabilize the Kuan sword. In the next moment, Nietian frowned and looked at Lan Zhuiying, asking nervously, "Lan Zhuiying, are you all right?" In the next battle, he still needed Lan Zhuiying's help. If the latter were to be seriously injured now, it would be terrible. Lan Zhuiying took a deep breath, and the blood at the corner of her mouth disappeared. Her complexion improved a little as she nodded and said, I'm fine. Nie Tian sensed that Lan Zhuying's aura was very stable, so he was relieved. At that moment, he looked at Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao, who were in the Qin sword. His eyes were extremely gloomy, like a ferocious beast. The moment just now was too dangerous. Fortunately, it was only Ying Longxiao who attacked. If Ying Longxiao and Zhu Zia attacked at the same time and activated the Qin sword, it would be terrible. Ying Longxiao alone activated the Qin sword, and it already had such power. If Zhu Zia's power was added, then it was extremely likely that Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying would be killed. Nie Tian, you're dead. At that moment, Ying Longxiao's eyes turned cold, and a cold light surged out his eyes. It was like a sharp blade, extremely cold. Boom! In the next moment, his entire body sword aura was released again, and it crashed into the Qin sword. Suddenly, the Qin sword danced in the air, and the space within hundreds of thousands of meters was filled with an extremely terrifying sword aura. Ying Longxiao's murderous intent towards Nie Tian was extremely strong, and it was as if he wanted to kill Nie Tian with a single strike. However, Zhu Zia, who was beside him, had an ugly expression on his face. As Qinya, he was known as the #1 genius of the Qinquan sect, but now, Ying Longxiao had the initiative, and he could only passively cooperate. This situation made him very dissatisfied. However, even if he was dissatisfied, he could only hold it in for now. He had to cooperate with Ying Longxiao to defeat Nie Tian. This was the death order that Ying Changfeng had given him and Ying Longxiao. Therefore, this Qinquan battle wasn't just a battle of sword aura, but also a battle of life and death for him and Ying Longxiao. Nie Tian, he's coming again. Lan Zhuying exclaimed as she sensed the enormous pressure coming from the Qin sword. Her beautiful eyes trembled with fear. Follow my sword aura. Nie Tian frowned, but he didn't look too flustered as he said in a deep voice. In the next moment, Nie Tian's sword aura surged out of his body, turning into sword shadows that crashed into the Kuan sword. Instantly, the Kuan sword was stimulated, and it began to release a terrifying sword aura. Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes flickered as she felt the surging sword aura from Nie Tian. She began to release her own sword aura, cooperating with Nie Tian to activate the power of the Kuan sword. Boom! Then, the Kuan sword was like a wild dragon, crazily rolling and crashing into the void, exploding with a terrifying sword aura. Boom! Boom! High up in the sky, the two sword shadows were like two giant beasts, crazily attacking as if they had the power to destroy everything. Bang! In the next instant, the two swords clashed against each other, and the sound of metal colliding rang out in the air. After that, a terrifying shockwave spread out in all directions. Everywhere the shockwave passed by, the heavens and earth trembled, as though doomsday had arrived. The crowd retreated again, unable to withstand the impact of the collision of the two swords. Swordsmen were in the cosmos of the sword. After their sword aura passed through the sword matrix, their sword aura would be greatly enhanced. Therefore, at this moment, the battle between the two swords was more intense than the battle between Saint Tianyi and the warrior. At this moment, the two sword shadows clashed in the void, neither giving way to the other. They were like two giant beasts wrestling with each other. Die! At this moment, Ying Longxiao growled, and the sword aura all over his body exploded. Suddenly, the aura of the Kuan sword skyrocketed. Bang! Then, there was a terrifying muffled sound in the void. The Kuan sword trembled in the air, then retreated thousands of meters, leaving a dazzling sword aura in the sky. Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying, who were in the Kuan sword, also suffered a terrifying impact. Their bodies trembled, and they vomited blood again. Damn it! Nie Tian growled, and his eyes darkened. With a thought, the sword aura all over his body began to explode wildly, and the sword aura was as violent as a landslide. At this moment, he directly activated the sacred spirit of sky evolution. Archean sacred spirit. High up in the sky, Ying Changfeng's eyes were burning with excitement when he saw this, and he almost screamed. Chapter 36:29. Extreme shamelessness high up in the sky. Ing Chongfeng saw Nyekton use the Archean Saint Soul, and the sword momentum of his body rose violently, but he was not nervous at all. Instead, his eyes were trembling with excitement, revealing a sense of fanaticism. He wanted to see Nye Tian use the Archean Saint Soul. Boom! At the moment when Nye Tian activated the Archean Saint Soul, the sword intent in his body was extremely violent and terrifying. Then, under the stimulation of the sword intent, the momentum of the Kuan sword skyrocketed. The terrible sword momentum burst out and hit the void, as if it was going to tear the world apart. What a strong aura! The crowd, who was more than 100,000 meters away, could feel the fluctuation of the sword intent coming from the sky. They could not help but tremble, and the shock in their hearts could not be any greater. Who would have thought that Nye Tian would burst out such a terrible sword intent in an instant? Boom! In the next moment, the Qinquan dual swords collided with each other, and suddenly there was a roar in the void. Then, an extremely powerful and shocking momentum was released like a rolling wave, as if to drown the whole world. Boom! Between heaven and earth, the violent impact was endless, and it was a scene of doomsday. In the middle of the most tragic collision, even time and space were twisted. Boom! After a while, a terrible muffled sound was heard, and the Qinquan dual swords trembled in the void at the same time, then immediately separated, and there was a distance of tens of thousands of meters between them. Buzz! In the void, a deafening sound of the sword rang out, and the cry of a crane could be heard for a long time. The eyes of the crowd trembled, and they were stunned by the scene in front of them. In this Qinquan duel, the strength of both sides was obviously not strong, but the intensity of the battle was far beyond everyone's expectations. In particular, the power that Nye Tian burst out was too terrifying. Damn it! Inside the Qinquan sword, Ing Longxiao was like a wild beast. He roared, and his hair flew in the void, as if he had gone mad. In the collision just now, Nye Tian was not at a disadvantage at all, and even used the power of the Kuan sword to suppress his Qinquan sword. He had never dreamed that Nye Tian would be able to adapt to the Kuan sword so quickly. Previously, it had taken him 4 or 5 days to truly grasp the method to activate the Qin sword. As for Nye Tian, he didn't need to use any time at all. As soon as he entered the Kuan sword, he could directly activate its power. By now, the power that Nye Tian could unleash from the Kuan sword was no less than his own. After activating the primordial twin souls, Nye Tian's sword Dao strength far surpassed Ing Longxiao's. It wasn't strange that the Kuan sword could suppress the Qin sword. Idiot! At this time, Zhu Zia let out a low roar and said coldly, "If you don't want to lose, then let me control the Qin sword." Ing Longxiao's face suddenly darkened and became extremely ugly. His pair of eyes gloomily looked at Zhu Zia, clearly very angry. In the Qinquan Gate, he had always been suppressed by Zhu Zia. No matter when people talked about geniuses of the Qinquan sword, the first name they mentioned would always be Zhu Zia, followed by Ing Longxiao. Ing Longxiao's own strength was indeed inferior to Zhu Zia's, but he wasn't convinced. This time, he had the opportunity to enter the Qinquan sword in advance, to cultivate and familiarize himself with the Qinquan sword in advance. He originally thought that he could occupy the dominant position and kill Nye Tian in one move. If that was the case, not only would he truly suppress Zhu Zia in front of everyone, but he would also be able to absorb Nye Tian's sword intent through the Qin sword. In the future, with the improvement that Nye Tian's sword intent brought to him, he would no longer be weaker than Zhu Zia. In the future, when people talked about the Qinquan sword, the first person they would think of would be him, Ing Longxiao. However, his thinking was too simple. Nye Tian's adaptation to the Kuan sword far exceeded his expectations. At this time, even if he used his full strength, he wouldn't be able to pose a threat to Nye Tian. Just as Zhu Zia said, if Ing Longxiao continued to control the Qin sword, then this pair of Qinquan swordsmen would most likely lose this Qinquan battle. Ing Longxiao, if you don't want to die, Then get out of my way. Zhu Zia saw that Ing Longxiao was still hesitating and immediately roared. Ing Longxiao's gaze trembled as he suppressed the terrifying anger in his heart. However, after a moment, he still gave way to Zhu Zia. He knew that Zhu Zia's strength was stronger than his. Especially after Zhu Zia came out of seclusion, his sword Dao's strength had increased tremendously. At the same time, within the Kuan's sword, Nie Tian stabilized his body. His eyes were bloodshot and beads of sweat oozed from his forehead. His expression was very ugly. Nie Tian, what's wrong? Lan Zhuying saw Nie Tian's appearance, and her beautiful eyes flickered as she asked nervously. In exchange, just now, the Kuan sword had the upper hand. Why did Nie Tian look like he was seriously injured? I'm fine. Nie Tian's face was gloomy as he waved his hand. However, his face became even uglier. It was as pale as a sheet, and his entire body looked like it was enduring an incomparably huge pressure. Indeed, at the moment, he was enduring an unimaginably huge sword pressure. Just now, when he activated the primordial twin souls, the Kuan sword released a terrifying sword pressure that pressed down from all directions. It was like an invisible giant hand that pressed down on him, making it hard for him to breathe. Nie Tian was very puzzled. Why would such a terrifying sword pressure be triggered after activating the primordial sacred souls? Despicable. At this moment, the Ghost Emperor's voice suddenly rang out. The Kuan sword has been tampered with. What do you mean? Nie Tian's eyes trembled as he exclaimed in horror. The Kuan sword's runes have been imbued with a curse power. It has a special ability to sense the primordial sacred souls. Therefore, after you activated the primordial sacred souls, you felt the surrounding sword pressure skyrocket. The Ghost Emperor's eyes trembled slightly. Through the fluctuations of the surrounding aura, he could sense the terrifying sword pressure Nie Tian was enduring at the moment. Fortunately, Nie Tian's martial body was strong. Otherwise, he would have been directly suppressed to death. Shameless. Nie Tian's eyes suddenly narrowed as he roared furiously. Of course, he knew that Ing Changfeng must have tampered with the Kuan sword. Back when he fought with Ing Longxiao, he had used the primordial twin souls. Ing Changfeng had been secretly watching the battle, so it was not surprising that he knew he had the primordial twin souls. In fact, Nie Tian even felt that Ing Changfeng had designed the Cosmos sword for his primordial twin souls. Nie Tian, how long can you last under such terrifying sword pressure? Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled as he stared at Nie Tian from high up in the sky and said gloomily. The curse power in the Kuan sword was set up in advance to target Nie Tian's primordial twin souls. At this moment, Nie Tian's body suddenly trembled as he spat out a mouthful of blood. His face became extremely pale. Chapter 3630. Resonance of Heaven and Earth, Nie Tian. Lan Zhuying exclaimed when she saw Nie Tian suddenly vomiting blood. She didn't sense anything out of the ordinary and didn't know what was happening to Nie Tian. The sword pressure produced by the curse only targeted the immemorial sacred soul, so Lan Zhuying naturally couldn't sense it. Damn it! Nie Tian's eyes were bloodshot as he growled. His entire body was drenched in cold sweat and his face was drained of blood. He felt that the sword pressure was becoming more and more terrifying. It made his entire body feel like it was being torn apart. It was as if there were countless sharp blades inside his body that were slowly tearing it apart. What's going on? Everyone looked at Nie Tian from afar, unsure of what was happening to him. Nie Tian can't hold on any longer? Ing Changfeng looked at Nie Tian from afar with a ferocious smile on his face, revealing a twisted sense of pleasure. Good chance. At this moment, Zhu Zia was gradually familiarizing himself with the Qian sword. When he saw Nie Tian suddenly vomiting blood, his eyes lit up and he let out a low roar. Then, sword intent erupted from his body and rushed towards the Qian sword. Kill him. At the same time, Ing Longxiao roared. Sword intent surged out from his body and cooperated with Ing Longxiao to activate the power of the Qian sword. Boom! In an instant, the Qian sword exploded with a terrifying sword aura. The sword radiance surged in the void and spread in all directions, forming a sea of sword radiance. The sharp and powerful sword intent impacted the void, causing the surrounding time and space to tremble. Kill! In the next instant, Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao roared at the same time. The Qian sword slashed across the void, and wherever the sword radiance passed, heaven and earth would be torn apart. Boom! Then, the Qian sword swooped down like a raging dragon. Instantly, a boundlessly powerful force of the sword formation erupted and blasted the Kuan sword. So powerful, the eyes of the crowd trembled, and they could not help but cry out. Their eyes were blazing, as if they could already see the scene of the Kuan sword being directly smashed. "Nie Tian, you're dead for sure." Ying Longxiao's eyes trembled, and he actually laughed maniacally. He was certain that Nie Tian would definitely not be able to withstand this strike. Within the Kuan sword, Nie Tian's face was as pale as a sheet. He was panting heavily, and he seemed to be in a sorry state. Nie Tian, Lan Jing's beautiful eyes trembled with terror as she gazed at Qian Jian that was pouncing over ferociously, and she cried out anxiously, "Activate your sword spirit body and cooperate with me." Nie Tian's eyes flickered slightly. He took a deep breath and forcefully stabilized his body before unleashing his primordial twin souls once again. Streams of ferocious sword intent burst out from his body. Boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, streams of sword intent circulated in the void, and in an instant, they formed 9 sword intent vortexes in 9 different locations. Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes trembled. She was extremely intelligent, and she immediately understood that these 9 sword intent vortexes were the unique positions of the Kuan sword. When the sword intent struck those positions, it could erupt with even more power. Boom! In the next moment, Lan Zhuiying's eyes trembled slightly, and she activated the eye of the sword spirit. Instantly, all the sword intent in her body surged out in a frenzy, and it charged towards the 9 sword intent vortexes. Boom! 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 Subsequently, the 9 sword intent vortexes erupted like volcanoes after being impacted by the sword intent. Streams of terrifying sword formation energy were released in a frenzy, and it spread out like a tsunami. Buzz! Subsequently, the Kuan sword was stimulated, and the sword formation energy was released once again. The entire sword trembled in the void, and a clear sword cry resounded. After that, layers of sword rays appeared, and countless ripples of sword intent appeared in the air. It was extremely beautiful. What's going on? Everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them and cried out in alarm. Some of the people present had seen the Qingquan showdown before, but they had never seen a scene like this. It seemed that the Kuan sword had unleashed extraordinary power under the stimulation of Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying. How is this possible? High up in the sky, Ying Chongfeng's eyes narrowed in shock. He could not believe his eyes, and his face stiffened. Never in his dreams would he have thought that Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying would actually cause the universe to resonate. The resonance of the universe referred to the fusion of the aura of the swordsman and the Qian sword or the Kuan sword. After obtaining the acknowledgement of the Qian sword or the Kuan sword, the resonance of the universe would occur. Under the resonance of the universe, the might of the Qian sword or the Kuan sword would increase by several times. Both Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were similarly shocked by the scene in front of them. Their expressions could not help but change. Rumble. However, at this moment, the Qian Kuan dual swords collided, and an unprecedented strong collision erupted. Suddenly, the void shook, and at the center of the collision, a terrifying, devouring sword intent spread out. The sword raised soared into the sky and turned into a raging force that seemed to tear and shatter the world. The eyes of the crowd trembled, and they could not help but tremble. They could not believe the scene in front of them. Boom, boom, boom. High up in the sky, the roaring sound continued, the violent sword intent, whistling extremely murderous roar, extremely terrifying. Bang! After a long time, a muffled sound was heard. The Qian Kuan dual swords separated again, and each retreated tens of thousands of meters away. Everyone's eyes trembled as they looked at the four people in the Qian Kuan dual swords. Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao were in the Qian sword. The former was covered in blood, and his face was pale. The latter looked terrified, and there were several bloody wounds on his body. He was also seriously injured. Because Zhu Zia was the leader of the Qian sword, the impact he received was far greater than Ying Longshao, and his injuries were also more serious. They did not understand why Nie Tian and Lan Zhuying were so much stronger than the Qian sword. Their strength was clearly far inferior to theirs. Why was the Kuan sword so much stronger than the Qian sword? And in the Kuan sword, Lan Zhuiying's delicate body trembled slightly. Her face was pale, and there was a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. Nie Tian's situation was even worse. His body was covered in bloody wounds, and his body was dyed red. His face was twisted, and his eyes were as dark as the abyss. He looked extremely terrifying. However, Nie Tian was not injured by Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao, but by the Kuan sword. Just now, he had forcefully used the primordial sacred soul, causing the sword pressure on his body to increase by several times. At this moment, he had to activate the God-Fiend body to barely withstand the sword pressure. Otherwise, he would have been crushed to death by the sword pressure. That moment just now was really very dangerous. The Ghost Emperor helped Nie Tian find the 9 major array positions of the Kuan sword. Then, Nie Tian used his own sword intent as a guide to let Lan Zhuiying release the sword intent of the sword spirit body, which triggered the Qian Kuan sword resonance. Lan Zhuiying was a sword spirit body, and the sword intent in her body was the sword intent of heaven and earth. It contained the Tao of heaven and earth. Her sword intent could stimulate the power of the Kuan sword several times. Because of this, the Qian Kuan sword resonance appeared. Otherwise, with the strength of Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying's sword Tao, they might not be able to fight against Zhu Zia alone, let alone the Qian Kuan dragon. The Qian Kuan resonance was the reason why Nie Tian chose Lan Zhuiying as his teammate. Such a huge sword pressure actually did not force out the primordial sacred soul. High up in the sky, Ying Changfeng's eyes were extremely cold and trembling. He was almost roaring. He had no choice but to admit that he underestimated Nie Tian too much. He never thought that under the sword pressure of the Kuan sword, Nie Tian could actually persist for so long. However, he did not think that Nie Tian could still hold on. Under the stimulation of the primordial twin souls, the sword pressure released by the Kuan sword would become greater and greater. Very soon, it would reach the point where even great sage Lord Tianyi powerhouses could not withstand it. Chapter 36:31. Chapter 36:26. Chapter 36:26. Forceful absorption. Nie Tian, are you all right? Lan Zhuiying asked nervously as she looked at Nie Tian, who was covered in blood, from within the Kuan sword. She had used up almost all the sword intent in her body to trigger the resonance of Qian Kuan. She would not be of any help in the following battle. She still could not understand why Nie Tian was injured so badly. The Master of the Sky is too weak after all. He is not as strong as the Qian Kuan sword. Everyone frowned as they looked at Nie Tian within the Kuan sword. They could tell that Nie Tian's injuries were far worse than Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao. Therefore, they assumed that Nie Tian's strength was below Zhu Zia and Ying Longshao. However, they did not know that Nie Tian was not injured by Zhu Zia or Ying Longshao, but by the cursed power within the Kuan sword. I'm fine. Nie Tian's eyes were filled with killing intent and as deep as an abyss. He felt as if his martial body was about to explode, as if it was about to be torn apart. Nie Tian, you won't be able to take it if this goes on. Let's begin. The Ghost Emperor's deep voice was heard. Nie Tian's dark eyes nodded slightly. He had originally hoped to use Lan Zhuiying's sword spirit body to buy more time for him, but now he was the one who couldn't hold on any longer. Lan Zhuiying, enter the 9 extremities. Nie Tian looked at Lan Zhuiying and said in a deep voice, Nie Tian, what are you doing? Lan Zhuiying was stunned. She had a bad feeling about this. I don't know what will happen next. It's safer for you to stay in the nine extremities. Nietion's eyes were dark as he said. Lan Zhuing thought for a while and eventually decided to enter the nine extremities. Her sword intent was almost exhausted. Even if she continued to stay by Nietion's side, it would be useless. She might even become a burden to Nietion. Then let's begin. After Lan Zhuing entered the nine superbs, Nietion suddenly raised his head and looked cold at Ing Changfeng, who was high up in the sky. The corner of his mouth pulled into a strange smile, which made him look very evil. When Ing Changfeng realized that Nietion was looking at him, he could not help but narrow his eyes and freeze for a moment. Vaguely, he had an ominous premonition. It seemed that Nietion was plotting something. Lulu, it's time for you to perform. At this moment, Nietion smiled faintly and said in a deep voice, I can't wait any longer. Lulu, who hadn't appeared for a long time, chuckled. Then, the Saint Soul blood seal on Nietion's forehead trembled. Rays of white halos spread out, forming white ripples in the void. Then the entire Kuan sword suddenly trembled. Suddenly, the surrounding void began to tremble violently, as if it was about to collapse. Boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, the sword intent in the Kuan sword suddenly became active. Then, it began to flow crazily and poured into the Saint Soul blood seal. Zhu Zia and Ing Longxiao's eyes trembled violently when they saw this scene. They couldn't believe their eyes. Nietion was actually directly absorbing the sword intent in the Kuan sword. The sword intent in the Kuan sword was ferocious and violent. Nietion was only at the 8th level of heavenly charm. How could he withstand such a terrifying power? Is this guy crazy? Ing Changfeng, who was high up in the sky, squinted his eyes and shouted in horror. He never thought that Nietion would do such a thing at this time. Not to mention Nietion, even Ing Changfeng couldn't withstand the power of forcibly absorbing the sword intent of the entire Kuan sword. However, Nietion seemed to be very calm at this time. It was as if he had already decided to do this before entering the Kuan sword. Boom, boom, boom. In the Kuan sword, Nietion's ears were roaring incessantly. The sword intent flowed crazily and poured into the Saint's Soul blood seal. Nietion was like a black hole, crazily absorbing the sword intent, and his martial body was withstanding unimaginably terrifying pressure. At the same time, the clear sky sword in his hand shone brightly. Waves of incomparably vigorous sword intent aura surged, extremely huge. Indeed, Ing Changfeng and the others were right. With Nietion's martial body, it was impossible for him to withstand the power of the Kuan sword. Even the Saint Soul blood seal was far from being able to directly absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword. However, Nietion had one thing on him that could withstand the sword intent of the Kuan sword, and that was the Sky Sword. The Sky Sword was engraved with sword patterns in the sky. It was an incomparably huge sword array. Although the Kuan sword was strong, it was far from enough compared to the sword array in the sky. At this moment, Nietion was only using the Saint Soul blood seal as a medium to absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword and pour it into the Sky Sword. In this way, not only could he absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword, but he could also stimulate the power of the sword array in the sky. At this time, Ing Changfeng could not help but feel puzzled when he saw that Nietion had absorbed a lot of sword intent, but had no reaction. Then he sensed that the aura on the Sky Sword had begun to change. He suddenly thought of something, and his expression changed as he exclaimed, "Oh no!" He finally understood that Nietion wanted to use the power of the Kuan sword to stimulate the sword array in the sky. Damn it! Ing Changfeng growled when he sensed this. His entire being was like a berserk, ferocious beast. He had never thought that Nietion would have such a method to absorb the sword intent of the Kuan sword. No, I can't let him absorb the power of the Kuan sword. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled as he roared in his heart. If Nietion absorbed the power of the Kuan sword, it would be terrible. Zhu Zia, Ing Longxiao, the battle is not over yet. The next moment, Enchantment looked at the two people in the Qian sword cold. He could no longer care about anything else and growled. Zhu Zia and Ing Longxiao's eyes narrowed as they reacted. Boom! The two of them looked at each other, and their sword intent erupted crazily, attacking the Qian sword. Suddenly, a huge sword shadow released a boundless sword momentum. The void immediately trembled as if it was about to collapse. Kill! The next moment, Zhu Zia and Ing Longxiao growled at the same time. The Qian sword streaked across the void, and a huge sword light appeared in the air. Like a waterfall of flowing light, it descended from the sky and pressed down on the Koan sword. Boom! Suddenly, the air trembled from the pressure, and the surrounding space was suddenly pulled taut. It actually began to distort and flip around. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression did not change much. He activated the Holy Soul Blood Seal and absorbed the power of the Koan sword even more violently. Waves of terrifying sword intent surged into the Sky Sword and activated the sword array in the Sky Sword. Bang! The next moment, the entire Koan sword could no longer withstand it and collapsed. The remaining sword intent dissipated in the void. In the blink of an eye, Nie Tian had absorbed almost all the power of the Koan sword. Chapter 36-32. The power of the sword formation. He used the sword formation in the sky to absorb the power of the Koan sword and activate a small part of the sword formation on the Sky Sword. However, he could feel that the small part of the sword formation in the Sky Sword contained immense power. How is this possible? Everyone was stunned by the scene in front of them. The shock in their hearts was written all over their faces. No one had expected that something like this would happen. It seemed that Nie Tian had absorbed the Koan sword directly. It was too strange. Boom! At this moment, the Qian sword in the void pressed down on Nie Tian like a giant dragon. A violent whistling sound was heard in the air, and the violent power was extremely ear-piercing. Nie Tian suddenly looked up at this moment and raised the Sky Sword in his hand slightly. Every move he made seemed to be the only one in the world. It was as if he was the ruler of this world. Boom! In the next moment, as a thought entered Nie Tian's mind, the clear Sky Sword surged with an unparalleled sword aura, which spread out in all directions. Immediately, an enormous sword formation appeared in the void, standing in the air like a giant. The shocking scene caused everyone's eyes to tremble, and they all sucked in a breath of cold air. Their faces were filled with disbelief. Who would have thought that after Nie Tian absorbed the power of the Koan sword, he would release a sword formation that was even more terrifying than the Koan sword? Boom! Right at this moment, Nie Tian took a step forward, and the sword formation around him emanated a strand of enormous force that caused the space in the surroundings to sink while the heavens and the earth trembled incessantly. What a terrifying power! Nie Tian's eyes trembled slightly, and he exclaimed in surprise. He did not expect that after the power of the Koan sword entered the Sky Sword, it could activate such a huge power of the sword formation. Bang! Next, the Qian sword collided with the sword formation in the air. Like two giant primordial beasts, a terrifying explosion rang out in the air. A terrifying shockwave appeared, crazily spreading out in all directions. It was as if a huge wave was about to destroy everything. Everyone felt the momentum that could devour the world. Their eyes trembled violently, and they retreated again. Bang! In the next moment, an even more terrifying sound rang out. The Qian sword trembled in the air, and then it was sent flying over 100,000 meters away. Pooh! Puffed! Inside the Qian sword, Zhu Zia and Ing Longxiao didn't even have time to stabilize their bodies before they spat out blood. The two of them were horrified, and they forcefully released their sword intents to stabilize the Qian sword. However, at this moment, they saw that a huge crack had appeared on the Qian sword. It was several thousand meters long, and it seemed like it was going to shatter at the very next moment. The Qian sword collided head-on with Nie Tian's sword formation, but it was actually shaken to the point of almost collapsing. On the other hand, the sword formation outside Nie Tian's body suddenly operated, and waves of sword intent aura surged in the void like a mountain of sword intent. How is this possible? Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao's expressions changed as they exclaimed in unison. They had already used all their strength to activate the Qian sword, yet they were still unable to contend against Nie Tian. What in the world did Nie Tian do to the Kuan sword? Everyone's eyes trembled, each pair of eyes staring at Nie Tian. No words were able to express the shock in their hearts at this moment. Nie Tian was virtually resisting the Qian, yet Kunlong's teaming up with his power alone. Rumble. And right at this time, the Qian sword suddenly vibrated strangely. Following that, a surge of sword intent was released, and it actually directly enveloped Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao. The two people's faces changed in fright, and they cried out at the same time. Following that, an even more terrifying scene happened. That surge of sword intent imprisoned them and actually started to forcefully absorb their sword intent. At the same time, that crack on the Qian sword started to slowly heal. Nie Tian's brows furrowed, being stunned by the scene before him. The Qian sword was actually devouring Zhu Zia's and Ying Longxiao's sword intent to repair the crack. Everyone was similarly stunned by this bizarre scene and was speechless for a moment. Ying Changfeng stood tall in the sky with a gloomy expression. No one knew what he was thinking about. His original plan was to use the cursed power in the Kuan sword to force out the two primordial holy souls in Nie Tian's body, then let Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao defeat Nie Tian. By the time Nie Tian's sword intent was pretty much devoured, the heart of the sky would be forced out. What he wanted was not just the two primordial holy souls. More importantly, it was the heart of the sky. Although he was the Heaven and Earth Gate Master, he was also a member of the 5 major factions. He knew the terror of the heart of the sky better than others. When he was young, he had once entered the sky sword marshal, but he failed to fuse with the heart of the sky. Presently, Nie Tian fused with the heart of the sky and became the Lord of the Sky. If he could force out Nie Tian's heart of the sky, perhaps he could fuse with the heart of the sky. However, Ying Changfeng clearly underestimated Nie Tian. Everything that happened in front of him at this moment far exceeded his expectations. The Kuan sword was absorbed by Nie Tian. It seemed like the battle between heaven and earth no longer existed. Under normal circumstances, the Qian sword and the Kuan sword would devour the sword intent of the swordsman. After the Qian and Kuan confrontation, the Qian sword and the Kuan sword would eventually fuse together. Then, the victor would be able to absorb some of the sword intent in the Qian Kuan sword. But now, the Kuan sword was gone. The Qian and Kuan confrontation only existed in name. Nie Tianling stood in the sword array and looked at Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao in the Qian sword from afar. He did not expect the sword array to have such power. It almost shattered the Qian sword. However, the current him was not feeling good. He was enduring the pressure from the sword array in the sky, making his martial body nearly tear apart. Save me. At this time, Zhu Zia's eyes suddenly trembled and he shouted loudly. The Qian sword was frantically devouring his and Ying Longxiao's sword intent. It wouldn't be long before their sword Dao cultivation would be completely crippled. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly. He could not help but look at Ying Changfeng in the sky. The latter's face was gloomy, and he did not have the slightest reaction. It was as if he did not see Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao at all. Nie Tian frowned. He never thought that he would have to devour Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao's sword intent. He did not care about this at all. But now, Zhu Zia and Ying Longxiao were imprisoned by the Qian sword and were in an extremely dangerous situation. Save me. Zhu Zia's eyes trembled as he looked at Nie Tian from afar. He was almost begging. If Ying Changfeng did not make a move, the only person present who could save them was Nie Tian. Ying Longxiao also looked at Nie Tian. He no longer had the insolence from before. His eyes were surging with pain, despair, and begging. Boom! Nie Tian's eyes slightly darkened. He took a step forward and the void trembled. Then, the sword in the sky in his hand suddenly moved and the sword array changed. The endless power of the sword array condensed into a huge sword shadow in the void and suppressed the Qian sword. The crowd's eyes trembled and they could not help but exclaim. They thought that Nie Tian was going to kill Zhu Zia Yinglong Xiao. Chapter 36:33. Chapter 36:28. Chapter 36:28. Sky is out of control high up in the sky. Ying Chongfeng's eyes flickered with a cold light as he stared fixedly at Nie Tian with killing intent. However, he didn't make a move right away. Instead, he was observing. At this moment, the sword formation surrounding Nie Tian's body made him feel threatened. Hence, he had to wait for an opportunity. Don't kill me. At this moment, Zhu Zia and Yinglong Xiao looked at the gigantic sword shadow descending from the sky. Their eyes trembled violently, and they cried out at the same time. Their expressions were extremely shocked. Even though they were within the Qian sword, they could still feel the enormous pressure coming from the sword images. The destructive aura caused them to feel despair. The eyes of the crowd trembled. It seemed that when the sword shadow descended, it would be the moment Zhu Zia and Yinglong Xiao would perish. Boom! In the next moment, the gigantic sword image crashed down like a mountain, directly descending upon the Qian sword. The space instantly trembled, and the heavens and the earth became solemn. In an instant, boundless waves of power erupted and spread madly in all directions. Rumble, rumble, rumble. Above the horizon, violent waves surged to the heavens. It was as if 10,000 demons were dancing wildly, as if they wanted to devour and annihilate everything. The crowd was pushed back once again. Boom! It was so much so that even the Universal Palace was affected by the pressure. It trembled for a moment, and it seemed as if it would collapse in the next moment. Break! At this moment, Nie Tian's eyes darkened slightly. With a low roar, the sword light formation above the sword in the sky suddenly erupted. Instantly, the sword light surged over 100,000 meters. Bang! After that, the enormous Qian sword trembled in space, and then it actually collapsed into pieces. It transformed into boundless waves of sword intent that were completely absorbed by the sword formation. Huh! The crowd was shocked by the scene in front of them, and they all exclaimed in surprise. Who would have thought that after Nie Tian used the power of the sword formation to shatter the Qian sword, the sword formation would actually absorb the Qian sword's sword intent? Bang! Bang! At this moment, two muffled sounds rang out as two silhouettes were sent flying backwards. They were none other than Zhu Zia and Yinglong Xiao. The two of them retreated several thousand meters in the air before finally stabilizing themselves. They stood in the air with blank expressions on their faces. Nie Tian had shattered the Qian sword with a single sword strike, yet he hadn't injured them at all. At this moment, they had broken free from the shackles of the Qian sword, and their sword intent hadn't weakened at all. It's him. He saved us. Zhu Zia and Yinglong Xiao's eyes trembled. They finally reacted and said in astonishment. They were indeed asking for help from Nie Tian, but they didn't expect that Nie Tian would actually save them. If Nie Tian didn't make a move, all of their sword intent would be devoured by the Qian sword. Even if they were lucky enough to survive, their cultivation in the sword Dao would be completely crippled. At this moment, Nie Tian stood high up in the sky. After absorbing the energy of the Qian sword, the sword formation around him expanded once more. A powerful and ferocious sword will gushed out in the void in the surroundings, causing the world to tremble endlessly as even time and space started to distort. Nie Tian's gaze suddenly focused while his expression became extremely unsightly. He noticed to his astonishment that after the sword formation absorbed the energy of the Qian sword, it actually showed signs of going out of control, and it seemed as if it was on the verge of losing control. Oh no! At this moment, the Ghost Emperor exclaimed in panic. Originally, after the sword in the sky absorbed the energy of the Koan sword, the power of the sword formation skyrocketed. It was extremely difficult for Nie Tian to control this power. Now that the sword formation in the sky was activated and absorbed the energy of the Qian sword, Nie Tian was far from being able to control it. Damn it! Nie Tian growled. The hand that was gripping the sword in the sky was trembling nonstop, as if it would fall out of his hand at the next moment. The power of the sword formation after it erupted was simply too strong. and he couldn't control it at all. In the next moment, several cracks appeared on Nietion's arm. Blood gushed out, and his entire arm seemed like it was about to break. Nietion, let go. The Ghost Emperor yelled in panic. If Nietion continued to hold the sword in the sky, his martial body wouldn't be able to withstand it all, and it was extremely likely that he would explode. I won't let go. Nietion's eyes trembled, but he let out a low roar. His pair of dark eyes looked extremely frightening. At this moment, he had a strong feeling that if he let go, he would never be able to hold the sword in the sky again. Buzz! At this moment, the sword in the sky suddenly trembled and let out a deep and powerful sword cry. Following this, a terrifying sword aura soared into the sky, causing the surrounding void to shake violently. Bang, bang, bang. In an instant, Nietion heard a cracking sound coming from within his body. It turned out that his bones and meridians had directly cracked under the impact of the sword in the sky. Nietion, let go. The Ghost Emperor's eyes narrowed in horror as he shouted, "You will die." The power of the sword formation in the sky was too strong. If Nietion didn't let go, he might really be killed by it. I am the Lord of the Sky. I will never let go. Nietion's body was in extreme pain, but his eyes were like the most terrifying abyss, extremely gloomy. Both of his hands held the sword in the sky tightly, not letting go at all. Nietion, are you crazy? The Ghost Emperor roared when he saw this scene. Nietion was like a madman, completely reckless. Most importantly, the Ghost Emperor didn't understand why Nietion was so persistent. Rumble, rumble, rumble. At this moment, a terrifying sword aura appeared and spread in all directions. Everywhere it passed, even time and space were twisted. It was extremely terrifying. The sky and earth were extremely gloomy, as if it was about to collapse. What's going on? Everyone retreated once again, countless eyes fixed on Nietion from afar, the shock in their hearts to the extreme. They didn't understand what was going on. It seemed that the huge sword formation around Nietion's body was out of control. The sky is out of control. This is my chance. Enchantment looked at Nietion from high up in the sky. His eyes were burning with excitement. Of course, he could tell that the sky sword in Nietion's hand had gone out of control because it had absorbed too much power. Nietion was too weak to control the sky sword. If Nietion let go of the sky sword now, Enchantment would definitely pick up the sky sword without hesitation. As long as he could subdue the sky sword, it would be easy for him to merge with the heart of the sky. Everything went better than Enchantment had expected. Right at this moment, Nietion suddenly threw his head back and let out a miserable howl. Under the impact of the clear sky sword, the skin and flesh on both of his arms were lacerated. On his arms, white bones were directly exposed, and on the white bones, there were actually numerous cracks. The power of the sky sword was so terrifying that it shattered Nietion's skin and flesh and cracked his bones and meridians. Gasp! The crowd gasped when they saw this scene. They were all dumbfounded. It was hard to imagine what kind of pain Nietion was suffering at this moment. However, Nietion's pair of skeletal hands still did not loosen its grip. Like an iron pincer, it tightly held onto the clear sky sword. Chapter 36-34. Sword's Disaster Master. The crowd suddenly felt a terrifying fluctuation of sword essence. They looked up and saw Enchantment's figure. They couldn't help but tremble and scream. Enchantment suddenly attacked. What was he going to do? Nietion let go. Floating in midair, Enchantment let out a bellow. Then his body shook, and a strand of sword intent was unleashed. With a loud whistle, it condensed into a blade of killing intent and slashed towards Nietion. Nietion felt a chill. He looked up, and his eyes couldn't help but tremble. He didn't expect Enchantment to be so shameless as to attack him at this time. Impossible. Nietion's eyes flickered with an incomparably determined light. He let out an explosive roar as he raised his hands and slashed the clear heaven sword across the sky. A sword light that was tens of thousands of meters long blossomed, causing the surrounding void to tremble. Boom! In the next instant, the sword formation in the sky released a huge sword essence. A sword shadow appeared in the sky. It was as huge as a giant beast with an incomparably majestic momentum and directly pressed down on Ing Chongfeng. Huh? Ing Chongfeng felt the sword pressure coming toward him. His eyes trembled, and he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. He didn't expect Nie Tian to be able to control the sword formation to resist under such circumstances. Nie Tian's strength wasn't strong enough to threaten him at all. However, the sword formation in the sky was very terrifying and was enough to pose a threat to Ing Chongfeng. Ing Chongfeng's expression changed slightly. A long sword appeared in his hand, and he slashed with it. A huge sword shadow appeared in the void and actually emitted the sound of monstrous waves. The sword shadow was like a wild wave that carried the momentum of a storm and resisted the pressure of the sword formation. Boom! As the sword formation fell, the void suddenly sank and the world seemed to collapse. Suddenly, the sword essence spread in all directions and wreaked havoc between heaven and earth. Ing Chongfeng's figure moved, and he retreated thousands of meters. After he stabilized his body, there was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth, and his face was gloomy. He did not expect that the power of the sword that Nie Tian released through the sword formation would be so terrifying. He used the Sword of Yuan's spirit and used all his strength, but he was only barely able to block it. In that instant, just now, if his reaction had been slightly slower, he would have been killed by the power of the sword formation. The crowd was shocked by the scene in the sky, and they all cried out in surprise. Who would have thought that Ing Chongfeng, the Qingquan Gate Master, would actually be repelled by Nie Tian with a single sword strike? However, Nie Tian's situation was getting worse. His skin and flesh began to disintegrate bit by bit along his arms. All the bones and meridians in his body were ruptured. His entire body was on the verge of collapse, like a broken leaf in a storm. Nie Tian, you can't hold on any longer. Let go. The Ghost Emperor's voice rang out again. Nie Tian's eyes flickered, but he did not let go. Instead, his body shook as the 9 heavenly shackles in his body were unleashed. They turned into heavenly runes that were engraved on his body like a brand. Lunatic! The Ghost Emperor's eyes darkened as he let out a roar. Nie Tian was too crazy. He had used the power of the heavenly shackles to forcibly stabilize his body. Although such a clumsy method could temporarily support his martial physique, it multiplied the pain he had to endure. Nie Tian's entire body was in extreme pain. He let out a roar and looked like a ferocious beast. Nie Tian, I'd like to see how long you can hold on. Ing Chongfeng glared at Nie Tian with a murderous look in his eyes. He no longer concealed his emotions. The long-wind sword in his hand slashed across the sky and executed the 7 ultimate waves breaker once again. A terrifying sword aura was emitted as the sword swept across, causing time and space to distort. A vortex of sword intent appeared wherever the sword passed. Boom! In the next instant, the vortex of sword intent moved and pressed down on Nie Tian. The exploding sword aura seemed like it was going to tear the earth and sky apart. Suddenly, a terrifying aura of sword intent surged and filled the space within hundreds of thousands of meters. Ing Chongfeng's eyes were filled with killing intent. Since he had already made his move, he had to kill Nie Tian and obtain the heart of the sky. Has Lord Sect Master gone mad? Everyone looked at Ing Chongfeng with trembling eyes. They could not believe that Ing Chongfeng would dare to kill Nie Tian in front of so many people. In any case, even if Ing Chongfeng did not admit it, Nie Tian was still the master of the sky. If Nie Tian were to die in Ing Chongfeng's hands, would the other 4 factions let it go so easily? Ing Chongfeng's current actions were simply digging a grave for the Qingquan sect. However, Ing Chongfeng had almost lost his mind for the sake of the heart of the sky. He was attacking crazily and recklessly. At that moment, he only had eyes for the heart of the sky. Although he was the Qingquan sect leader, the Qingquan sect was nothing in his eyes. If he killed Nie Tian and incurred the wrath of the other 4 factions, he could just leave the Qingquan sect. The all-heaven sacred world was so huge. Even if the four factions joined forces, they would not be able to find him easily. However, once he obtained the heart of the sky, his future achievements would definitely be limitless. Ing Changfeng was attacking completely for his own sake. He did not care about the life and death of the Qingquan sect at all. Boom! At that moment, a huge sword shadow appeared high in the sky. It was like a huge wave, and the sound of surging waves could be heard in the void. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying sword aura descended. The void seemed to freeze as it actually paused for a moment. Nie Tian's eyes suddenly darkened, and his expression changed. He felt an almost suffocating pressure in the sword formation. As the Qingquan sect leader, Ing Changfeng's strength was extremely terrifying. His martial cultivation had reached the peak of the Zongyun sacred world, the 9th level of heavenly righteousness. His sword Dao had reached the sword heavenly tribulation realm, the 9th level. The sage realm sword Dao had 6 major realms: sword rhythm, oracle, sacred meaning, sword heavenly tribulation, sword sense god-defying, and sword martial saint. The Zongyun sacred world was a mid-level sacred world. Warriors were restricted by the world's level, and a 9th level of heavenly righteousness great sage was the limit. However, the suppression of the world's level on the sword Dao was far lower than the suppression on the martial Dao. Therefore, Ing Changfeng's sword Dao could reach the shocking 9th level of sword heavenly tribulation realm. Among the sage realm's 6 sword Daos, the first 3 were the mortal sage swords, and the last 3 were the exalted sage swords. Ing Changfeng's 9th level of sword heavenly tribulation realm was extremely terrifying. It was no exaggeration to say that his sword Dao cultivation was enough to face a heavenly tribulation sage expert head-on. At that moment, Ing Changfeng had made up his mind to kill. He no longer held back against Nie Tian and attacked with all his might. The sword Heavenly Tribulation Swordsman contained the power of heavenly tribulation in every sword intent. It was a kind of tribulation power of heaven and earth, and it was extremely oppressive to warriors who were slightly weaker. Kill! At that moment, Nie Tian's eyes darkened slightly. Without any fear, he let out a low roar. A pair of skeletal hands covered in heavenly Dao runes suddenly rose, and the sky sword let out a low sword hum in the air. Chapter 36-35. The Power of Heavenly Tribulation. Kill. Nie Tian let out a low roar and slashed down with the sword in the sky. The power of the sword formation was forcibly activated, and a vast and unparalleled sword momentum was released. It was violent, overbearing, and extremely terrifying. Boom! The monstrous aura of the sword intent surged in the void and revealed a devouring aura. It was like a mad beast that suddenly became angry and seemed to want to devour everything in front of it. The sword formation in the sky absorbed the power of heaven and earth in the sword, and the Qingquan dual swords contained extremely terrifying devouring power. Therefore, it was not surprising that the sword intent contained the devouring power. The crowd shouted at the huge sword shadow in the sky. Their eyes were trembling, and their faces were filled with disbelief. They could not believe that Nie Tian could burst out such a terrifying power. Nie Tian was clearly unable to control the sword formation before. At this moment, he could forcibly suppress the martial body and activate the power of the sword formation. This terrifying willpower was too abnormal. Boom! At this moment, the 2 sword shadows in the void collided with each other. It was like 2 giant beasts from ancient times. Heaven and earth trembled, and the sword will surged endlessly in all directions, as if it wanted to engulf the world. Boom, boom, boom. Above the sky, the rumbling sound was endless. The endless waves turned into a terrifying impact, causing the surrounding space to become distorted. Countless space-time turbulence appeared in the sky. The sword intent and devouring aura filled the space between heaven and earth. It was extremely violent. Bang! After a long time, a shocking explosion was heard. Then, the 2 sword shadows trembled at the same time and directly collapsed. Rumble! Suddenly, endless waves of sword will spread out like a stormy sea, tumbling endlessly and blasting everything in its path. The crowd had retreated hundreds of thousands of meters away, but they could still feel the violent aura that covered the earth. It was extremely terrifying, as if it could annihilate everything. At this moment, Ying Chongfeng's figure flew backward and drew a line of blood in the void. When he stabilized his body, his entire body was dripping with blood. His eyes were like those of a fierce beast, flickering with greed and unconcealable fear. He couldn't imagine how Niet Tian could erupt with such terrifying power. With the help of the sword array in the sky, Niet Tian was able to fight against him, the leader of the Qingquan Gate. However, at this time, Niet Tian was similarly suffering, and his injuries were even more severe than Ying Chongfeng's. Ying Chongfeng's sword contained the terrifying power of the heavenly tribulation. The sword intent seeped into Niet Tian's martial body through the sword array, filling his flesh, meridians, and bones with the violent power of the heavenly tribulation. Coupled with the terrifying pressure from a sky sword, the pressure Niet Tian's martial body endured was unimaginably terrifying. If he hadn't forcefully stabilized his martial body with the heavenly Tao shackles, his martial body would have collapsed long ago. But at this moment, the power of the heavenly Tao shackles was slowly weakening. Niet Tian's martial body was trembling nonstop, as if it could collapse at any time. This is bad. At this time, the Ghost Emperor's voice rang out, sounding extremely panicked. He had never imagined that the battle before him would reach this point. The fact that Niet Tian could last until now had far exceeded his expectations. But at this moment, the power of the sword Heavenly Tribulation had seeped into Niet Tian's body. This was extremely troublesome. If it didn't immediately force out the power of the Heavenly Tribulation, Niet Tian's martial body would be torn apart bit by bit. The reason why there was a qualitative difference between a Sage Monarch and Sage Monarch Tianyi was the power of the Heavenly Tribulation. Heavenly Tribulation was a tribulation from the heavens. Every martial artist who wanted to advance to the Heavenly Tribulation realm had to undergo the test of the Heavenly Tribulation. Many Sage Monarch Tianyi martial artists didn't dare to rashly attack the Heavenly Tribulation realm because they were afraid of being killed by the power of the Heavenly Tribulation. Under normal circumstances, only 1/10 of the martial artists who attacked the Heavenly Tribulation realm would be able to successfully break through. The remaining 9/10 would be killed by the power of the Heavenly Tribulation. The sword Heavenly Tribulation was actually the same. It wasn't much different from the martial Tao's Heavenly Tribulation. Niet Tian only had the cultivation of the 8th level Heavenly Charm. Even if his martial body was strong, it was far from being able to withstand the power of the Heavenly Tribulation. The berserk power of the Heavenly Tribulation in his body would take his life. At this moment, Niet Tian looked at Ying Chongfeng, who was high up in the sky. His eyes were incomparably gloomy, flickering with a cold and murderous glint. Ying Chongfeng's shamelessness had exceeded his expectations. He had actually attacked him in front of so many people. At this moment, he also had killing intent in his heart. He could borrow the power of the sword formation in the sky to kill Ying Chongfeng. Niet Tian, how much longer can you hold on? Ying Chongfeng stabilized his body and stared at Niet Tian with a piercing cold intent in his eyes. He was practically roaring. He was obviously feeling guilty at this moment. He didn't expect Niet Tian to be able to hold on until this point. It's enough to kill you, Niet Tian Tianling said coldly. He then took a step forward and the surrounding void suddenly sank. Then a terrifying blood qi surged outside his body. Suddenly, the sword formation in the sky released a soaring sword aura as if it was going to destroy everything. At this moment, Niet Tian could no longer care about anything else. He actually burned his own blood qi to kill Ying Chongfeng. Ying Chongfeng's expression changed when he felt the terrifying sword pressure. He said in a trembling voice, "Are you going to kill me? Why can't I?" Niet Tian shouted in a low voice. The sword formation in the sky's aura was still soaring. Since he had already made up his mind to kill, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He must kill Ying Chongfeng with the next sword attack. Do you dare to kill this sect master in front of so many Qingquan sect swordsmen? Ing Chongfeng's eyes were trembling, and his eyes were clearly filled with fear as he shouted wildly. At this moment, he finally remembered that he was the sect master of the Qingquan sect. However, at this moment, the surrounding crowd was watching from afar and retreating. Ing Chongfeng frowned. He was so shocked that he couldn't say a word. Am I really going to die in the hands of Nie Tian? Die. At this moment, Nie Tian let out a low roar. The sword formation in the sky suddenly moved and a roar exploded in the void. It was about to collapse. Ing Chongfeng's eyes suddenly narrowed. At this moment, he could really feel the aura of death. However, at this moment, Nie Tian's body trembled violently. Then he spat out a mouthful of blood. The heavenly shackles that wrapped around his body had directly collapsed. Oh no! In an instant, Nie Tian's eyes trembled and he screamed at his heart. Then the sword formation in the sky around his body collapsed. He felt a terrifying force in his body. It was like a flood or a ferocious beast that was attacking his martial body. It seemed like it was going to tear his entire body apart. Oh no! The power of the heavenly tribulation is acting up. At the same time, the Ghost Emperor's voice was heard. He screamed and his throat went numb. Chapter 36:36. An uninvited guest bang, bang, bang. Nie Tian stood high up in the sky and his body kept trembling. He heard cracking sounds coming from his body. It was the sound of his meridians and bones being destroyed by the power of heaven's retribution. His body swayed like a small boat floating in the boundless sea, and his consciousness began to blur. What's wrong with Nie Tian? Everyone looked at the scene high up in the sky and could not help but tremble. They exclaimed in unison, not knowing what was happening to Nie Tian. This is my chance. At that moment, Ing Chongfeng's eyes were burning and he shouted in surprise. His face became ferocious because of his fanaticism. The sudden change made him overjoyed because it had brought him the best opportunity. Go to hell. The next moment, Ing Chongfeng roared and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He took a step forward and rushed toward Nie Tian like a bolt of lightning. The crowd's eyes trembled. They did not expect that Ing Chongfeng would still attack Nie Tian under such circumstances. Nie Tian's eyes trembled and his consciousness began to blur. He could only vaguely see Ing Chongfeng's figure approaching him. Boom! At that moment, Ing Chongfeng slashed out with his sword. A violent sword shadow appeared and pressed directly toward Nie Tian. If the sword fell, Nie Tian would definitely die on the spot. At the moment of life and death, a sudden change occurred. Ing Chongfeng. A deep voice sounded in the void. Then, the void seemed to be torn apart, and a space-time vortex appeared. A black-clothed figure walked out of it. Boom! The crowd's eyes trembled violently as they looked up at the black-clothed figure. They saw that the person had slammed his palm down, and the surrounding void suddenly sank. A giant flaming palm appeared in the void and suddenly fell. When the flaming palm shadow fell, a strange scene happened. The sword shadow in the void was instantly torn apart and collapsed in the blink of an eye as if it had evaporated. At this moment, the black-robed figure landed directly. The surrounding void suddenly sank, as if it was shrouded by a terrifying pressure. Then the man stretched out his hand, and a fiery sword intent gushed out, enveloping Nie Tian. However, Nie Tian had already fallen into a coma. Who are you? Ing Chongfeng was taken aback by the sudden scene. After he stabilized his body, he let out a low roar and screamed. Ing Chongfeng, how dare you try to kill the Lord of the Sky in front of so many people? The man suddenly turned around and locked his blade-like eyes on Ing Chongfeng. Do you know that what you're doing is treason? He said coldly. You? Ing Chongfeng's eyes couldn't help but tremble when he saw this person. He let out a cry of horror, and his entire body began to tremble as if he had seen a very frightening scene. His voice trembled as he said, You are Mo Yun Fan. Ing Chongfeng, at least you still remember me. Mo Yun Fan smiled faintly. His eyes were cold as he said playfully, You didn't expect this, did you? Mo Yun Fan, am back again. You, are you dead? Ing Chongfeng screamed in horror. His voice had become extremely sharp. Of course, he was no stranger to the name Mo Yunfan, as this was the person who had grown up with him. He was his senior brother. The heavens have eyes and allowed me, Mo Yunfan, to live until now. The corners of Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched as he said coldly, "Ing Changfeng, you must be very desperate to see that I'm still alive." You. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled and he was speechless. At that moment, everyone looked at Mo Yunfan in surprise and confusion. Only some of the older swordsmen present knew Mo Yunfan's name. A long time ago, Mo Yunfan and Ing Changfeng were senior brothers. At that time, the two of them were the most outstanding swordsmen in the Qinquan sect. They were the Qinquan swordsmen of their generation, just like Zhu Zia and Ing Longshao. As a senior brother, Mo Yunfan's strength had always been slightly stronger than Ing Changfeng's. However, one day, the two of them actually had a Qinquan showdown for some unknown reason. The outcome of that battle was beyond everyone's expectations. Mo Yunfan was defeated miserably. Not only did Ing Changfeng devour his sword intent, but he was also expelled from the Qinquan sect and went missing. According to rumors, Ing Changfeng was afraid that Mo Yunfan would take revenge, so he secretly killed Mo Yunfan. Who would have thought that many years later, when Ing Changfeng was already the Qinquan sect master, Mo Yunfan would actually appear again? Furthermore, the Mo Yunfan who appeared again was actually stronger than Ing Changfeng. Ing Changfeng, you didn't kill me back then. I am Mo Yunfan. Swear that when I return to the Qinquan sect again, you will pay 100 times, 1,000 times the price. Mo Yunfan's eyes were incomparably gloomy as he stared cold at Ing Changfeng and practically enunciated every word. During the Qinquan showdown between him and Ing Changfeng back then, he fell into Ing Changfeng's trap, which led to a crushing defeat. After he was expelled from the Qinquan sect, Ing Changfeng actually did not let him go and actually sent someone to assassinate him. The heavens had eyes, allowing him to live, and to live until now. Today, he returned to the Qinquan sect, and it was the moment when Ing Changfeng paid the price. Mo Yunfan, what right do you have to make me pay the price? I'm the Qinquan sect master now, and you are just a traitor of the Qinquan sect. Ing Changfeng calmed down a lot at this time and said with a cold smile, "Is that so?" Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched a little. He then extended his hand and revealed a sword-shaped token. He smiled coldly and said, "Ing Changfeng, as the Qinquan sect master, you should recognize this token, right? This is..." Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled when he saw the token in Mo Yunfan's hand. He exclaimed, "This is the Sword of the Sky token. Not bad. You're not too stupid." Mo Yunfan smiled faintly with a cold, murderous intent surging in his eyes. You're from a Sword of the Sky token?" Ing Changfeng's expression suddenly changed. His eyes trembled as he was extremely shocked. Sword of the Sky token. Everyone's eyes trembled violently when they heard this name and exclaimed in unison. The people from the Heart of the Sky token were no strangers to the Sword of the Sky token. The Sword of the Sky token was also the force behind the Heart of the Sky token, but it was not one of the 5 forces. It was considered the 6th force outside of the 5 forces. The Sword of the Sky token transcended the 5 forces and played the role of maintaining the balance of the 5 forces. Each of the 5 forces had their own strengths and weaknesses. If it was not for the existence of the Sword of the Sky token, the weaker forces would have long been swallowed by the stronger forces. It was rumored that the Sword of the Sky token existed for the sake of the Lord of the Sky token. However, after the 5 forces had coexisted peacefully for such a long time, the Sword of the Sky token had not appeared for a long time. The swordsmen from the 5 forces had almost forgotten about the existence of the Sword of the Sky token. This is impossible. Ing Changfeng looked at Mo Yunfan. Suddenly, his eyes trembled and he exclaimed, "You can't be from the Sword of the Sky token. Back then, I had already swallowed your sword intent and destroyed your sword cultivation. Even if you could survive, you wouldn't be able to hold a sword again. The Sword of the Sky token wouldn't want someone who couldn't hold a sword. Chapter 36-37. Plotting Treason Boom. As soon as Mo Yunfan took a step forward, a mighty sword momentum soared into the sky, causing the surrounding void to tremble slightly. The space within tens of thousands of meters was filled with extremely terrifying sword intent, forming a huge sword intent vortex with Mo Yunfan as the center. The surrounding time and space began to tumble under the pressure of the sword intent vortex. The momentum of heaven and earth changed, as if heaven and earth were bowing to Mo Yunfan. How is this possible? Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled as he felt the sword pressure coming toward him, and he cried out in shock. Of course, he recognized the sword intent vortex. It was the sword perception vortex, a power that could only be released by a swordsman who had achieved the anti-god sword perception state. This undoubtedly meant that Mo Yunfan was already a swordsman who had achieved the anti-god sword perception state. However, this was simply impossible. Mo Yunfan's sword intent had been devoured by him back then, and his sword principle had been completely destroyed. How could he become an anti-god sword practitioner? And his sword principle strength was even stronger than his, the Qinkuan Gate Master. Ing Chongfeng's eyes could not stop trembling, and one could imagine the shock in his heart. He couldn't understand what had happened to Mo Yunfan. Ing Chongfeng, are you surprised? Mo Yunfan looked at Ing Chongfeng, who was in a state of shock, and said with a cold smile, "Thank you for your viciousness back then. Otherwise, I, Mo Yunfan, would not be here today." As his cold voice fell, Mo Yunfan's eyes suddenly darkened, and his killing intent was revealed. What? What are you going to do? Ing Chongfeng's pupil shrank when he sensed the cold, killing intent. His voice began to tremble, and it was obvious that he was panicking. He and Mo Yunfan had a deep hatred toward each other, and Mo Yunfan's return this time was obviously for revenge. Moreover, Mo Yunfan was now an anti-god sword practitioner, and his strength was far superior to his. Not to mention that he was currently seriously injured. Even if he was in peak condition, he would not be able to fight against an anti-god sword practitioner. The most terrifying thing was that Mo Yunfan was a member of the Sword Soul in the Sky, and his status was even higher than his, the Qinkuan Gate Master. At this moment, so many people had witnessed Ing Chongfeng trying to kill the Lord of the Sky. Mo Yunfan could totally kill Ing Chongfeng as the Sword Soul Enforcer in the Sky. In any case, Nie Tian had the title of the Master of the Sky. Even if the people of the 5 major forces did not acknowledge his identity, he was still the supreme supremacy of the 5 major forces in name. Anyone from the 5 forces who dared to lay a hand on Nie Tian would have to bear the name of treason. Mo Yunfan's appearance meant that the Sword Soul in the Sky had intervened. In a way, this was a great reinforcement for Nie Tian's position as the Lord of the Sky. At this moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Mo Yunfan, as if they were anticipating something. What do I want to do? Mo Yunfan's eyes were deep and murderous as he locked his gaze on Ing Chongfeng. His lips curled into a cold smile as he said, "Ing Chongfeng, what you did to me back then is enough for me to kill you 1,000 times. I'm a Qinkuan Gate Master. You dare to kill me?" Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled. Although his words were tough, his voice was trembling. "That's right." Mo Yunfan's lips curled into a smile as he said, "You're now the Qinkuan Gate Master and one of the 5 venerables in the sky. However, you seem to have forgotten that I'm now the Sword Soul Enforcer in the sky. I can enforce the law impartially and not care about past grievances. However, what you just did is a crime of treason. As the Sword Soul Enforcer, I can kill you right now." Ing Chongfeng immediately felt a roar in his head as soon as the word kill was uttered. His body could not help but sway as he took a few steps back and almost fell. Mo Yunfan was right. Based on what he just did, it was enough for Mo Yunfan to kill him. "Mo Yunfan, I'm the Qinkuan Gate Master. If you want to kill me, you'll have to get the approval of the masters of the other 4 forces." At that moment, Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled as he suddenly thought of something. "Is that so?" Mo Yunfan smiled cold and said, "Ing Chongfeng, your identity is indeed special. You're one of the 5 venerables in the sky, so you can't be killed so easily. However, you seem to have forgotten that the Sword Soul Enforcers in the sky have the right to kill first and report later under special circumstances. Kill first and report later? Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled when he heard those words. His body was drenched in cold sweat, and his spine and tailbone were ice cold. It was very obvious what kill first and report later meant. Mo Yunfan would directly kill Ing Chongfeng before the venerables in the sky knew about it. Given the hatred between Mo Yunfan and Ing Chongfeng, it was not strange for Mo Yunfan to kill first and report later. Mo Yunfan, we're in the Qingquan Gate now. Do you really dare to kill me, the Qingquan Gate master, in front of millions of Qingquan Gate disciples? Ing Chongfeng calmed down and looked coldly at Mo Yunfan. He believed that even if Mo Yunfan wanted to kill him, he would not dare to do so immediately. After all, they were in front of the Qingquan Palace. Qingquan Gate Master? Mo Yunfan sneered and glanced at the surrounding Qingquan Gate disciples. Then, he locked his gaze on Ing Chongfeng and sneered. Ing Chongfeng, do you remember that you're the Qingquan Gate Master now? When you killed the Master of the Sky just now, did it ever cross your mind that you're the Qingquan Gate Master? Do you know that the entire Qingquan Gate will bear the name of murdering their master together with you after killing the Master of the Sky Gate? I'm afraid you were only thinking about yourself at that time. You never thought about the entire Qingquan Gate. You ignored the entire Qingquan Gate for your own selfish desires. Don't you think that you're a little ridiculous as the Qingquan Gate Master? The cold voice was interrogative and sonorous. It was like a thunderclap that exploded in the ears of the Qingquan Gate disciples. At this moment, the way everyone looked at Ing Chongfeng could not help but change. While they were angry, there was also a hint of disdain. The swordsmen present were not fools. Before Mo Yunfan said those words, everyone felt that Ing Chongfeng's action of killing Nie Tian on the spot was very inappropriate. If Ing Chongfeng was dissatisfied with Nie Tian, he could have directly stated that he did not recognize Nie Tian as the Master of the Sky Gate. He could have even directly kicked Nie Tian out of the Qingquan Gate. However, it was completely inappropriate for him to kill Nie Tian on the spot. No matter what, Nie Tian's status was higher than Ing Chongfeng's in name, so killing him was considered a rebellion. Mo Yunfan, what do you want? Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled. At this moment, he truly realized the seriousness of the matter. His teeth were chattering as he spoke, and he could not even speak smoothly. Judging from Mo Yunfan's appearance, he would not let him off today. Chapter 36-38. 3 Things. Ing Chongfeng's eyes trembled slightly when he heard Mo Yunfan's words. He was like a desperate person who had suddenly grabbed onto a life-saving straw. The current situation was already a life-and-death situation for him. Mo Yunfan wanted to kill him, and the people of Qingquan's sect no longer trusted him as the sect master. In addition, he had framed Mo Yunfan and wanted to kill the Master of the Sky. He had committed all sorts of evil deeds that could not be punished. Mo Yunfan had asked for 3 favors and spared his life, which was already a huge favor. One must know that with Mo Yunfan's strength, killing a severely injured Ing Chongfeng was as easy as flipping his hand. Perhaps Mo Yunfan still remembered the brotherly relationship between the two of them. After all, the two of them grew up together and cultivated together. Although they were not related by blood, they were like brothers. Ing Chongfeng understood Mo Yunfan's character very well. The latter valued relationships and kept his promises. It was precisely because of this that Mo Yunfan was so easily schemed against by him back then. At the moment, Mo Yunfan's soft-heartedness made Ing Chongfeng feel that the latter was remembering the past. Senior brother, please speak. Ing Chongfeng's eyes flickered and revealed a blazing gaze. He even changed the way he addressed Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan's lips twitched as he said coldly, "The first thing is to abolish your own sword principle and step down as the sect master of Qingquan." Abolish my own sword principle? Ing Chongfeng's pupils constricted when he heard those words. His expression changed as he exclaimed, He was a swordsman with a cultivation base of the ninth heaven sword tribulation. This was the achievement of his hundreds of thousands of years of cultivation, and it was the most glorious thing in his life. However, Mo Yunfan actually asked him to abolish his own sword principle. This was simply more painful than killing him directly. He could ignore his identity as the sect master of Qinquan, but abolishing his own sword principle was too cruel for him. Senior brother, I can let you be the sect master of Qinquan, but can you abolish my own sword principle? Ying Changfeng suddenly raised his head and looked at Mo Yunfan. His eyes were filled with desire. Ying Changfeng. However, before Ying Changfeng could finish speaking, Mo Yunfan let out a deep roar and shouted Ying Changfeng's name word by word. His voice was as forceful as thunder and as cold as ice as he said, "Do you think that with my current strength and status, I would still care about the position of Qinquan Gate Master?" This. Ying Changfeng's expression changed in shock. He was stunned and speechless. Mo Yunfan was already a swordsman of the Defiant Sword Spirit, and he had also joined the Sky Sword Soul. Indeed, the position of Qinquan Gate Master was no longer important to him. Ying Changfeng, if you want to live, destroy your own sword principle right now. Mo Yunfan's eyes were deep and murderous as he stared at Ying Changfeng like a sharp blade and said, "I want you to experience the pain of having my sword Dao cultivation stripped away." Ying Changfeng's eyes widened as he uttered a cry of astonishment. The fear in his heart was written all over his face. Back then, he had devoured Mo Yunfan's sword intent in the name of the Qinquan Showdown. And now, Mo Yunfan wanted to get back at them. Moreover, he wanted to get back at them in front of all the disciples of the Qinquan Gate. "Live or die, it's your choice," Mo Yunfan said coldly. "I'll count to 3. I want to hear your answer." This. Ying Changfeng was horrified, and beads of sweat oozed out of his forehead like rain. 1, 2. At that moment, Mo Yunfan's voice was heard one after another. His voice was like a clap of thunder and a sharp blade that bombarded Ying Changfeng's ears and pierced his heart. 3. Mo Yunfan counted for the third time and took a step forward. His entire body's sword momentum erupted like a raging wave, causing the surrounding void to tremble as if it was about to collapse. "I want to live." Almost at the same time, Ying Changfeng roared. He was obviously panicking. "Very well." The corner of Mo Yunfan's mouth twitched. The smile on his face was extremely strange as he sneered. "My good junior brother, you really didn't let me down." Ying Changfeng's eyes trembled slightly as he was horrified. He suddenly had a feeling that he had fallen into Mo Yunfan's trap. If he destroyed his sword principle, he would be no different from an ordinary Lord Tianyi martial artist. However, he still had strength after all, so he chose to continue living. Just like Mo Yunfan in the past, there was only hope if he lived. Perhaps he could cultivate the sword principle again, like Mo Yunfan, and return to the Qinquan Gate. "Let's do it," Mo Yunfan said coldly with a sinister smile. Ying Changfeng's eyes trembled and his face became extremely ugly. He was stunned on the spot for a long time. "Let's do it," Mo Yunfan roared like thunder in the 9 heavens. Ying Changfeng's mind rumbled as if he had just woken up from a dream. There was a trace of despair in his eyes. He glanced at Mo Yunfan and saw that the latter had a cold expression. "All right." In the next instant, Ying Changfeng let out a deep roar and made up his mind. The sword intent in his body surged, and his body trembled. The sword intent in his body gushed out and was filled with a bloody aura. Everyone's eyes trembled and their expressions changed. In the blink of an eye, the sword intent in Ying Changfeng's body dissipated completely. His hundreds of thousands of years of sword principle cultivation was directly crippled. Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed, and a sinister smile appeared on his face. The second matter, Ying Changfeng, who was much calmer at the moment, shouted at Mo Yunfan with a cold expression. "Ying Changfeng, you and I are from the same sect, but you framed me with a scheme. You can't escape the name of killing a fellow disciple." Mo Yunfan smiled cold and said, "In the name of a senior brother, I will enforce the rules of the sect on behalf of my teacher. I will punish you to go to the cliff of repentance, to reflect on your mistakes, and never step out of the cliff of repentance for the rest of your life. Mo Yunfan. Ing Chongfeng's expression changed as he cried out in shock. His face was completely frozen. He had never expected that Mo Yunfan would first destroy his sword principle and then make him go to the cliff of repentance to reflect on his mistakes. Mo Yunfan was clearly trying to imprison him. At that moment, he suddenly understood what the sinister smile on Mo Yunfan's face meant. Mo Yunfan did not care about their past relationship at all. His methods were very sinister, and he wanted Ing Chongfeng to live a life worse than death. What? Don't you want to repent? Mo Yunfan smiled cold, and the corner of his lips curled into a smug expression. Ing Chongfeng was stunned for a long time before he finally reacted. His eyes became lifeless as he lifted his head and said, "The third matter." At that moment, his sword principle was destroyed. What else could he do other than listening to Mo Yunfan's manipulation? The third matter is very simple. Mo Yunfan smiled faintly and said, "Since you're no longer the Heaven and Earth Gate Master, you've also lost your identity as a supremacy of the sky. Now, hand over the 5 will of the sky in your hands." When Ing Chongfeng heard the words 5 will of the sky, his expression changed drastically, and he exclaimed, "You want the 5 will of the sky?" The heart of the sky was the leader of the 5 forces and became the 5 supremacies of the sky. In the hands of the 5 supremacies, each of them grasped a power that represented the will of the heart of the sky, and they were known as the 5 will of the sky. Chapter 36:39. Chapter 36:34. Chapter 36:34. Qianquan's sword intent. Why? Are you not willing to hand it over? Mo Yunfan looked at Ing Chongfeng, and his face darkened. A cold, murderous intent surged in his eyes. The Qianquan sect swordsmen's expressions changed when they saw this. They looked at Mo Yunfan with a strange expression. The 5 spirits in the sky represented the 5 supremacies in the sky. It was also the proof of the heart of the sky's 5 forces. As the enforcer of the sword soul in the sky, Missouri Yunfan could indeed remove Ing Chongfeng's position as the Qianquan sect master after he committed a grave mistake. However, Mo Yunfan was not qualified to take the 5 spirits in the sky. Strictly speaking, only martial supremacies in the sky could take the 5 spirits in the sky. Ing Chongfeng's position as the Qianquan sect master had been removed, and he was no longer the 5 supremacies in the sky. He should indeed hand over the 5 spirits in the sky. However, the 5 spirits in the sky should not be handed over to Mo Yunfan. It should be handed over to the next sect master of the Qianquan sect. The Qianquan sect had yet to select the next sect master. Hence, the 5 spirits in the sky should be handed over to the Elders Guild of the Qianquan sect and not Mo Yunfan. After all, Mo Yunfan was not even a member of the Qianquan sect. Mo Yunfan's direct request for the 5 spirits in the sky made people feel that he was up to no good. Mo Yunfan, even if I'm no longer the Qianquan sect master, the 5 spirits in the sky shouldn't be handed over to you, right? Ing Chongfeng's eyes darkened as he spoke coldly. At this time, he showed a bit of backbone. Ing Chongfeng, if you don't hand over the Qianquan sword intent to me, you and the entire Qianquan sect will be annihilated. Mo Yunfan said coldly. What do you mean? Ing Chongfeng's expression changed, and his eyes trembled again. Could it be that Mo Yunfan was going to wipe out the Qianquan sect for the 5 spirits in the sky? Do you think the master of the sky can still live? Mo Yunfan's expression changed slightly as he turned and locked his gaze on Nye Tian. Ing Chongfeng's eyes narrowed as he looked at Nye Tian. Nye Tian was wrapped in a ball of sword will of fire. He couldn't see him, but he could sense his aura. It was very weak and intermittent, as if it would disappear in the next moment. Ing Chongfeng's expression changed and was horrified. He immediately thought of something and said, "You want to use the universe sword intent to save Nye Tian?" When Nye Tian fought Ing Chongfeng just now, his body had been penetrated by the power of the heavenly tribulation. Coupled with the pressure from a sword array in the sky, he was already on the verge of death. If Mo Yunfan had not forcefully used his sword intent to help him stabilize his martial body, he would have already exploded and died. However, Mo Yunfan's sword intent was limited after all, and he could only protect Nie Tian for a while. Next, he had to force Nie Tian to expel the power of the heavenly tribulation from his body. Otherwise, he would definitely die. Mo Yunfan wanted the universe sword intent, one of the 5 essences in the sky, in order to save Nie Tian. At this moment, the universe sword intent was the only way Mo Yunfan could think of to save Nie Tian. Other than that, do you think there's any other way to save him? Mo Yunfan's eyes were low and cold. If Ing Changfeng hadn't insisted on snatching the heart of the sky, things wouldn't have turned out like this. But he's only in the 8th stage of Heaven Yun. How can he withstand the universe sword intent? Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled and his expression was very ugly. It's up to him whether he can bear it or not. Mo Yunfan said with a gloomy expression, "All I can do is give him a chance. If he dies, you should know what the consequences will be, right?" Ing Changfeng's expression changed, and he was speechless for a moment. If Nie Tian died, it would indeed be a disaster for the entire Qinkuan sect. Mo Yunfan's risky move was actually to save Nie Tian. The 5 essences in the sky originally belonged to the heart of the sky and existed to protect the will of the sky. However, even if the Lord of the Sky needed the 5 essences in the sky, it would require the consent of 3 of the 5 supremes in the sky under normal circumstances. However, at this moment, Nie Tian's life was at stake, and he urgently needed the 5 essences in the sky to save him. Mo Yunfan could only act according to special circumstances and directly use the universe sword intent to create a chance for Nie Tian to survive without anyone's consent. If you still think that you're from the Qinkuan sect, then hand over the universe sword intent. Mo Yunfan stopped talking nonsense with Ing Changfeng and said cold. Ing Changfeng's eyes trembled, and he only made up his mind after a long time. He flipped his palm, and a white ball of light the size of a fist appeared in his palm. It was one of the 5 essences in the sky, the universe sword intent. Boom! The moment the sword will of heaven and earth appeared, a formless sword will wave appeared. A huge ripple of sword will appeared in the void. Everyone felt their hearts tremble at this moment. Their expressions changed, and they were extremely shocked. It was hard to imagine that the universe sword intent, which was only the size of a fist, could release such a massive sword intent. Everyone's eyes trembled and they looked shocked. Although they had long heard of the universe sword intent, it was their first time seeing it in person. The shock in their hearts was written all over their faces. Take it. Ing Changfeng looked at the universe sword intent in his hand and narrowed his eyes before throwing it to Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan put away the universe sword intent and looked at Ing Changfeng with trembling eyes. Go to the cliff of repentance yourself. Ing Changfeng nodded and did not say anything. Then, Mo Yunfan glanced at everyone and said cold, "I'm going to treat the Lord of the Sky in the Universe Palace. No one is allowed to step into the Universe Palace without my orders." Yes, everyone responded in unison. Then an old man in white walked out. It was the great elder of the Qinkuan sect's elder union. His face was full of wrinkles, and his eyes were filled with worry. Mo Yunfan, you must save the Lord of the Sky. I'll try my best. Mo Yunfan nodded slightly and did not say anything else. His figure moved and directly brought Nie Tian into the Universe Palace. The swordsmen of the Qinkuan sect watched as Mo Yunfan and Nie Tian's figures disappeared into the Universe Palace. Their eyes trembled and no one left. They understood that if Nie Tian died today, the Qinkuan sect would face a disaster. Ing Changfeng's face was cold and his eyes were filled with despair. Nie Tian's strength was far beyond his expectations. Mo Yunfan's sudden arrival caught him off guard. Today, everything he had worked hard for in the first half of his life had been wasted. He would spend the rest of his life in the cliff of repentance. The dignified Qinkuan sect master had fallen to such a state in a few days. It was really regrettable. At the same time, in the Universe Palace, above the palace, Nie Tian was wrapped in the flame sword intent and suspended in the air like a burning flame. His breath of life was rapidly fading. The universe sword intent appeared in Mo Yunfan's hand. He looked at Nyetian with a gloomy face and said, "Lord of the Sky, whether you can survive this or not depends on yourself." Chapter 3640. Change of Heavens and Earthbang. Above the heavenly palace, Nyetian's body was enveloped by the heavenly sword intent, emitting a tremendous aura of the sword intent. The vigorous heavenly chi filled the entire heavenly palace. Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled as he stared at Nyetian, trying to sense the latter's life force. Meanwhile, a violent collision was taking place inside Nyetian's body. The heavenly sword intent sensed the aura of the heart of the sky and surged into Nyetian's body like a ferocious beast, impacting his meridians and bones. At the same time, the force of the heavenly tribulation in his body became extremely violent, resisting the invasion of the heavenly sword intent. Bang, bang, bang. The bones and meridians inside Nyetian's body that were initially damaged could no longer withstand the impact of the two powerful forces and began to crumble. Nyetian was like a broken leaf in an endless gale, being torn apart bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, his life force began to decline rapidly. The last bit of life force dropped to the freezing point and was about to disappear. Oh no! Mo Yunfan's expression changed when he sensed this. His nerves tightened, and his heart began to tremble inexplicably. If Nyetian was in his normal state, there was a high chance that he could merge with the heavenly sword intent. However, it was highly possible that his martial physique was already severely damaged and could no longer withstand the impact of the heavenly sword intent. Meanwhile, the life force on Nyetian's body had become extremely weak. Even Mo Yunfan, who was standing beside him, could only sense a faint aura. Nyetian was like a man hanging on a cliff, with his last bit of life force acting as the only rope holding him up. Once the wisp of life force disappeared, his life would come to an end. However, strangely enough, the last bit of life force was extremely tenacious. Although it was weak, it did not disappear. Such a strong will. Mo Yunfan's eyes widened slightly, as he was shocked. The reason why Nyetian had been able to persist for so long was because of his strong willpower. If it was an ordinary martial artist, they would have given up long ago. The fact that Nyetian could hold on until now was beyond Mo Yunfan's expectations. However, Nyetian's martial body was in a terrible state. His entire body's flesh and blood were festering, his meridians and bones were shattered, and his entire body was practically a skeleton. He was only supported by the universe sword intent outside his body. Otherwise, he would have collapsed long ago. After a while, the sword intent of the universe seemed to have gained the upper hand and began to slowly force out the power of the heavenly tribulation. At this moment, Nyetian's life force began to slowly recover. Lord of the Sky, you have to hold on. Mo Yunfan's eyes were burning with excitement, and his heart was about to jump out of his chest. The power of the heavenly tribulation was forced out, and the cosmic sword intent began to fuse with Nyetian's martial body. This was the scene he wanted to see the most. Next, as long as Nyetian stabilized his breathing, he would definitely be able to recover. Slowly, the cosmic sword intent poured into Nyetian's martial body and turned into the most powerful life force, nourishing his meridians and bones. After a long time, Nyetian's broken meridians and bones actually began to slowly recover. Success! Mo Yunfan's face changed, and his eyes flashed with a fiery light. He was so excited that he was about to jump up, but the next moment he seemed to sense something, and his face changed suddenly. His whole person was stunned on the spot, and his mouth was wide open, but he could not make a sound. What is that power? Mo Yunfan froze on the spot for a long time, and his face was almost numb before he spoke in surprise. Just a moment ago, he felt an extremely terrifying power in Nyetian's body, which made his divine soul tremble, and he felt a strong threat. However, when he tried to sense this power carefully, he couldn't sense it no matter how hard he tried. That power had mysteriously disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. This made Mo Yunfan very surprised, and he could not understand what was going on. But he was very sure that the feeling just now was not an illusion. In Nie Tian's body, there was indeed a terrifying power that had awakened. Then, Nie Tian continued to absorb the heaven and earth sword intent. Half a day later, all of the heavenly tribulation power was forced out of him, and his martial body gradually returned to normal with the help of the heaven and earth sword intent. Everything seemed to be developing in a good direction. But Mo Yunfan's face did not look good. He had been sensing Nie Tian's aura and did not dare to relax. But the strange thing was that he didn't sense that terrifying power again. At this moment, he really began to suspect that he had been hallucinating at that moment. There was a faint worry in his heart, and he felt that the power just now was extremely unusual. Then another half a day passed, and the cosmic sword intent was completely absorbed by Nie Tian. His martial body had almost recovered, and it looked intact. His flesh and blood were complete, and he no longer looked like a bloody skeleton. Phew! Seeing this, Mo Yunfan could not help but let out a long sigh of relief, and his tensed face relaxed a lot. But at that moment, his eyes suddenly trembled, and his expression changed again. Once again, he sensed that terrifying power. What's going on? Mo Yunfan was shocked, and he exclaimed in his heart. This time, the force didn't disappear. Instead, it grew stronger and stronger. Like a ferocious beast, it violently battered Nie Tian's martial body. At that moment, Nie Tian's meridians and bones that had just recovered were about to collapse from the impact again. Oh no! Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled, and his face turned pale, and his body was drenched in cold sweat. Just as he had expected, that power was indeed very unusual. Boom! Boom! At that moment, two terrifying powers appeared in Nie Tian's martial body, circulating throughout his body and stabilizing his meridians and bones. Primordial sacred souls. Mo Yunfan's expression changed again, and he immediately exclaimed. At that critical moment, the two primordial sacred souls in Nie Tian's body activated on their own to protect his meridians and bones. Boom! However, the next moment, the strange power suddenly increased, and a terrifying aura was released. Like an invisible giant hand, it filled every corner of Nie Tian's martial body. Following that, an extremely shocking scene occurred. That power directly devoured the two primordial sacred souls in an instant. That's right, it devoured them. The Sky Evolution sacred soul and the Myriad Tribulation sacred soul only lasted for a moment, and they were directly devoured by that power. Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed, and his face froze again, and he was speechless. Those were two primordial sacred souls, and they possessed infinite power, but they were devoured in an instant. It was too strange. What kind of power was so terrifying that it could devour two primordial sacred souls in an instant? Chapter 36:41. Soul of the Sky, Soul of the Sky. Mo Yunfan wore a blank expression as he blurted out the words. His eyes trembled as he stared at Nie Tian in astonishment, as if he had just witnessed something terrifying. He did not expect that Nie Tian would awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing the Qinquan sword intent. The clear sky soul was the only power he could think of that could devour two immemorial sacred souls in an instant. Mo Yunfan was certain that the force inside Nie Tian's body was the soul of the sky. However, he could not understand why Nie Tian would awaken the soul of the sky. According to the records of the Heart of the Sky, the Master of the Sky could only awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing 3 intents of the sky. However, Nie Tian was able to awaken the soul of the sky after absorbing 1 intent of the sky. This was too terrifying. Besides, Nie Tian's strength was too weak. With the cultivation of the 8th layer heavenly rhythm, could he really withstand the pressure from the soul of the sky? Mo Yunfan's heart was in a mess. He felt like his head was about to explode. The scene before him had completely exceeded his expectations. He had no idea what was going to happen to Nietian next. Bang! At this moment, Nietian's body trembled slightly. Then, a vast and boundless aura of sword intent was released, forming an invisible wave of sword intent in the void, spreading out like ripples. Puff! The sudden change caused Mo Yunfan's eyes to flicker. He could feel his heart shuddering as he vomited a mouthful of blood. At that instant, he could feel the sword intent in his body going out of control. It was burning like a flame, as if it was going to devour his entire body. Damn it! Mo Yunfan's expression sank as his eyes were filled with astonishment. He let out a furious roar as he tried to suppress the sword intent that was going out of control. Puff! However, the more he tried to suppress it, the more violent the sword intent became. His body trembled, and he spat out another mouthful of blood. At the same time, the swordsmen outside the Heaven and Earth Palace also felt the fluctuation of sword intent coming from the void. Their faces changed, and then their divine souls felt threatened. After a tremble, the sword intent in their bodies became violent, incomparably agitated, and crazily circulated in their martial bodies. PFFF, PFFF, PFFF. Following that, the sound of blood being spat out could be heard. The hundreds of thousands of swordsmen all spat out blood. Their faces turned pale in an instant, as if they had been severely injured. Just like Mo Yunfan, those swordsmen who tried to forcefully suppress the sword intent spat out another mouthful of blood, their faces turning even paler. What's going on? Everyone was frightened by this sudden change. Countless panicked faces looked at the people around them in fear. What was going on with that wave of sword intent? Why was it so powerful? Fortunately, that wave of sword intent soon disappeared, and everyone's sword intent quickly calmed down, no longer as violent as before. After the sword intent fluctuation disappeared, everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. However, everyone's faces were very pale, and their eyes were surging with fear. Hey, I've broken through. At this moment, suddenly someone shouted in surprise. I've broken through too. Following that, another person shouted in surprise. I've broken through too. I've broken through too. Following that, more surprised voices sounded. Everyone's panicked faces were instantly replaced by joy, and their eyes were blazing with excitement. After that wave of sword intent fluctuation disappeared, they actually found that their sword principal realm had magically broken through. At the same time, in the Heaven and Earth Palace, Mo Yunfan's expression was dull as he stared blankly at Nietian, who was floating in midair. His mouth was wide open, but he was completely speechless. He couldn't believe the scene in front of him. It was too terrifying. Outside Nietian's body, an extremely powerful sword intent surged, and a sharp aura was released, filling the entire Heaven and Earth Palace. Mo Yunfan was only about 10 meters away from Nietian, and he felt that his sword intent was completely suppressed by the sword intent in the space around him, and he couldn't fight back at all. This was what shocked him greatly. After all, he was a swordsman in Sword Sense Inverse Realm. Even a swordsman at the peak of Sword Sense Inverse Realm could not completely suppress him and make him unable to fight back. Only the swordsman of Saint Defire could suppress him to the point where he couldn't fight back. Nietian was only at the fourth heavenly realm of Sword Aura. In Saint Realm Sword Principle, he could only be considered a swordsman. A swordsman at the fourth heavenly realm of Sword Aura released a sword intent that made him a swordsman with Sword Sense Inverse Realm, unable to fight back. How could he not be surprised? Mo Yunfan experienced this personally, and the shock in his heart could not be any greater. If someone else had told him this, he would never have believed it. However, the sword intent that filled the air might be very oppressive, but it did not cause any harm to Mo Yunfan. Mo Yunfan thought that if the sword intent outside his body wanted to hurt him, it would definitely be able to kill him in an instant. The soul of the sky has awakened, and the sword intent released in an instant is actually so terrifying. It's comparable to that of a swordsman at the peak of Saint Defire. It's too terrifying. Mo Yunfan did not dare to fight back, fearing that the sword intent in the air would become violent. He looked at Nie Tian with trembling eyes, and he could not hide his fear. At that moment, he was certain that Nie Tian had indeed awakened the soul of the sky. Otherwise, with his level of cultivation, it would have been impossible for him to release such a terrifying sword intent. At that moment, an extremely terrifying change was happening in Nie Tian's body. The soul of the sky had awakened and devoured the two ancient sacred souls in his body. At the same time, it released a terrifying sword intent that surged in his body like a wild beast. As the sword intent surged, Nie Tian's flesh, blood, bones, and meridians all underwent shocking changes. Within his flesh, bones, and meridians, a terrifying sword intent seeped into them, instantly strengthening them greatly. Even their shapes changed subtly. His flesh, bones, and meridians were like sharp swords, exuding an incomparably sharp aura. Under the influence of the sword intent, his martial body became even stronger. After a long while, the sword intent in the air around him began to slowly weaken. It surged into Nie Tian's body and became one with it. This, Mo Yunfan looked at Nie Tian, and his eyes trembled slightly. He wanted to say something, but he could not. At that moment, Nie Tian's body trembled, and his tightly shut eyes opened. When Mo Yunfan saw that Nie Tian had woken up, his eyes lit up, and he shouted in surprise, "Lord of the Sky!" Chapter 36:42. Chapter 36:37. Chapter 36:37. Sword Soul Protection in the Universal Palace. Nie Tian stood still. It was as if he was no longer a person, but a sword. His entire body exuded an extremely sharp aura. At this moment, he felt a sword intent aura circulating in his body. It merged with his body and became his own strength. Sword Spirit Constitution. At this moment, the Ghost Emperor's voice suddenly sounded. He was extremely shocked. Nie Tian's flesh, blood, bones, and meridians were all filled with sword intent. Wasn't this the Sword Spirit Constitution? It seemed that after Nie Tian absorbed the universal sword intent and awakened the soul of the sky, he had directly nurtured the Sword Spirit Constitution. Moreover, his Sword Spirit Constitution was far stronger than an ordinary Sword Spirit Constitution. The sword intent just now had suppressed Mo Yunfan to the point where he couldn't fight back. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed slightly. With a thought, he sensed the sword intent aura in his body and couldn't help but smile. He could sense that his sword intent was much stronger than before. Without a doubt, the awakening of the soul of the sky had once again made a qualitative leap in his strength. However, his Sword Dao realm did not break through. It was still at the fourth heaven of sword aura. Because of this, one could see how powerful he was. The lower his cultivation level, the more it meant that he had great potential. At this moment, Nie Tian was confident that he could fight against a high-level oracle swordsman without activating the soul of the sky. If he activated the soul of the sky, he could probably kill any oracle swordsman in an instant. At this moment, Mo Yunfan's eyes trembled slightly, and he shouted again, "Lord of the Sky!" Only then did Nie Tian snap out of his daze. He landed on the ground and bowed deeply towards Mo Yunfan, expressing his sincere gratitude. "Thank you for saving my life, Senior." When Mo Yunfan appeared, his consciousness was already a little blurred, but he was still aware of the general situation. If Mo Yunfan hadn't appeared, even if Ing Chongfeng didn't kill him, he would have died under the power of the heavenly tribulation. Mo Yunfan fully deserved the debt of saving his life. "Lord of the Sky, you're exaggerating. The sword soul of the sky exists to protect the Lord of the Sky. I'm just doing my duty." Mo Yunfan was stunned for a moment before he responded with a faint smile. "You don't have to be so polite, Senior. Just call me Nie Tian." Nie Tian smiled. He was not used to being called the Lord of the Sky. "How can I do that? We are master and servant. How can I call the Lord of the Sky by his name?" Mo Yunfan was very respectful and respectful. Nie Tian smiled faintly and did not say anything. He didn't care about how he addressed him. Mo Yunfan could call him whatever he wanted. Mo Yunfan's attitude towards him was very sincere, unlike Ing Chongfeng's hypocrisy. At this moment, Nie Tian was most concerned about the heart of the sky. Next, Nie Tian asked Mo Yunfan about the heart of the sky, and the latter told Nie Tian everything he knew. Unfortunately, Mo Yunfan didn't know much about the heart of the sky. Nie Tian only roughly understood the 5 forces of the heart of the sky and some things about the sword soul of the sky. Lord of the Sky, if you want to know more about the heart of the sky, you must ask my teacher. Mo Yunfan knew what Nie Tian was most concerned about, so he said with a faint smile. Nie Tian's pupils constricted as he went blank. Your teacher? Yes. Mo Yunfan nodded and said, among the 5 forces, only one person knows about the heart of the sky. That person is my teacher, the leader of the Heaven Martial Association, Divine Heaven Ancestor. Divine Heaven Ancestor, the Scarlet Life, Loyal Heart. Nie Tian's eyes trembled after hearing Mo Yunfan's words. He didn't expect Mo Yunfan to be the disciple of the 8th Sky Messenger, Scarlet Life. Lord of the Sky knows, teacher? Mo Yunfan asked after seeing Nie Tian's reaction. Yes. Nie Tian nodded with a smile. When I was still in the realm, I encountered some trouble. It was Lord Scarlet Life Loyal Heart who helped me solve it. I didn't expect you to be his disciple. So that's how it is. Mo Yunfan slightly nodded with a trace of surprise on his face. He didn't expect Nie Tian to have seen the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart before. No wonder he always felt that there was a familiar aura within Nie Tian's sword intent. This subordinate was expelled from the Qinquan Gate, and my sword Dao cultivation was completely crippled. Fortunately, I met teacher. He saw that my aptitude was not bad, so he personally helped me recondense my sword intent and recultivate my sword Dao. Mo Yunfan recalled many things and said with a respectful expression, without teacher, there would be no Mo Yunfan today. Teacher has given me a new lease on life. Nie Tian nodded slightly. It turned out that Mo Yunfan had such a past. Lord of the Sky, are you going to meet the people from the other 4 forces? At this time, Mo Yunfan looked at Nie Tian and slightly frowned. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched slightly, but he didn't answer right away. What happened at the Qinquan Gate made him understand that his identity as the Lord of the Sky would not be easily recognized. Even in the Heaven Martial Association, where the Scarlet Life Loyal Heart was, most people would not be friendly to him. Ing Chongfeng actually wanted to kill him for the heart of the sky, which made him feel a lingering fear until now. If he went to the other forces, it was hard to guarantee that the same thing would not happen. The Qinquan Gate was the weakest among the 5 forces. Ing Chongfeng's matter had just been resolved, and Nie Tian really didn't want to see similar things happen again. If possible, he wanted to visit the other 4 forces after a period of time. At least, he had to wait until his strength was stronger. However, he had promised Zhong Mingyu that he would take the initiative to visit the 5 forces. If he delayed any more time, he was afraid that it would put Zhong Mingyu in a difficult position. Lord of the Sky, if you don't want to meet the people from the 4 forces now, I can inform the 4 forces in the name of the Sword Soul in the sky that you need some time. Mo Yunfan saw Nie Tian's hesitation and said in a deep voice, if I do that, won't the 4 forces resent me? Nie Tian frowned and asked in a deep voice, Lord of the Sky, don't worry. With the Sword Soul in the sky, even if the people from the 4 forces resent me, they will not openly resist. Mo Yunfan nodded and said, the existence of the Sword Soul in the sky was originally to protect the Lord of the Sky. Since it was not suitable for Nie Tian to meet the people from the 4 forces now, Mo Yunfan would naturally find a way to help him. This was the protection from the Sword Soul in the sky. Okay. Nie Tian nodded and looked much more relaxed. He really didn't want to see the incident with the Qinquan Gate repeat, and he also didn't want the venerables in the sky of the other forces to become another Ing Chongfeng. For the time being, not meeting the people from the other forces was the best solution at the moment. By the way, Senior, does the Sword Soul in the sky need new blood? At this time, Nietian squinted his eyes slightly and asked with some excitement. The Sword Soul in the Sky exists to protect the Lord of the Sky. It is very strict with the selection of new people. Not everyone can join the Sword Soul in the Sky. Mo Yunfan could obviously understand what Nietian meant, but his reaction was very cold. Even the Lord of the Sky could not interfere with the selection of new people by the Sword Soul in the Sky. Chapter 36:43. Chapter 36:38. Chapter 36:38. Rising in the Sky. Nietian could sense Mo Yunfan's indifference, but he still spoke his mind. He wanted Duanmu Lu and the others to join the Sword Spirit in the Sky. Master of the Sky, do you know how many Sword Spirits there are in the Sky? Mo Yunfan looked at Nietian impatiently. Nietian's expression grew grim as he shook his head. I don't know. There are only 36 official members. Mo Yunfan's eyes darkened as he said. Nietian frowned. He was stunned. He did not expect that there were only 36 Sword Spirits in the Sky outside of the 5 forces. The Sword Spirits in the Sky were supposed to protect the Master of the Sky and maintain the balance among the 5 forces. However, there were only 36 members in such a force. One had to know that even the weakest of the 5 forces, the Chinquin sect, had millions of disciples. Nietian realized how difficult it was for the Sword Spirits in the Sky to select new members. The Sword Spirit in the Sky is a sword that protects the Master of the Sky. This sword has its own sharpness. Even a Master of the Sky should not interfere with the Sword Spirits in the Sky. Mo Yunfan looked at Nietian and said seriously. Nietian frowned, and his expression was obviously not very good. Senior, you have not seen the person I want to recommend. It's not good to reject me directly. However, he did not give up and said with a smile. It was difficult for the Sword Spirits in the Sky to join, but this made Nietian even more determined. He must get Duanmu Lu and the others to join the Sword Spirits in the Sky. At least, he had to fight for an opportunity for Duanmu Lu and the others. He brought Duanmu Lu and the others to the Sacred World, but he did not give them a chance to train. Moreover, he had his own things to do. He did not have time to guide them. It might not be a good thing for Duanmu Lu and the others to follow him. For Duanmu Lu and the others, the Sword Soul in the Sky was a very good opportunity. It was worth a try. Therefore, even if he had to show his face, Nietian had to fight for a chance for them. Mo Yunfan frowned. He didn't expect Nietian to be so insistent. After a moment of silence, he said, Lord of the Sky, please bring those people here. But whether or not we can give them a chance is up to me. Moreover, I'm only giving them a chance. As for whether they can join the Sword Soul in the Sky, it's up to them. His expression was ugly. If Nietian was not the Lord of the Sky, he would have been furious. Of course, Nietian smiled faintly. He then had Duanmu Lu and the others come out from the 9 extremities. Are they the ones? Mo Yunfan glanced at Duanmu Lu and the others cold. He seemed a little dissatisfied. Indeed, Duanmu Lu and the others were very young. It was not bad for them to have such strength at their age. They could be called geniuses. However, such talent was still too weak to join the Sword Soul in the Sky. Mo Yunfan was the top genius of the Chinquin sect. Even so, he had tried many times before he finally joined the Sword Soul in the Sky. They all grew up in the territory. They followed me to the Sacred World. Nietian's eyes narrowed slightly, and he said in a deep voice, Senior, I'm not speaking as the leader of the Clear Heaven sect now, but as their teacher. Please give them a chance. Teacher, upon hearing this form of address, Mo Yunfan's eyes narrowed. At this moment, Nietian reminded him of his Crimson Life loyal heart. He had been able to join the Sword Soul in the Sky because of the Scarlet Life loyal heart's recommendation. He remembered clearly that the expression on the Crimson Life loyal heart's face at that moment was exactly the same as Nietian's. After thinking for a long time, Mo Yunfan finally agreed to give Duanmu Lu and the others a chance. Since they are martial artists from the territory, they are already very strong. I can take them back to the Sword Soul in the Sky, but whether they can stay or not is up to them. Nietian's eyes lit up as he hastily expressed his gratitude. Many thanks, Senior. He believed that what Duanmu Lu and the others needed was a chance. Nie Tian told Duanmu Lu and the others about the sword soul in the sky. In the end, he smiled and said, "I really got this chance by showing my face. I hope you can succeed. Teacher, don't worry. We will not let you down." Duanmu Lu nodded solemnly. In fact, he didn't want to stay with Nie Tian all the time. He didn't want to be a burden. Han Tian, Yang Zixiao, and Peng Xiongfei also nodded confidently. "I hope you can surprise me the next time I see you." Nie Tian glanced at the four disciples and smiled faintly. Yes, the four of them nodded and were slightly moved. "Next, you will take the cruelest test of the sword soul in the sky. I hope you can survive." Mo Yunfan glanced at Duanmu Lu and the others and said calmly, "I will." Duanmu Lu and the others nodded again. Their eyes were filled with extreme determination. They knew that this opportunity was hard to come by, so they would persist to the end and not let Nie Tian down. Next, Nie Tian and Mo Yunfan walked out of the Universal Palace together. The people of the Qinquan sect saw that the Master of the Sky was still alive. When the people of the Qinquan sect saw Nie Tian, they finally relaxed. They weren't glad that Nie Tian was still alive. They were glad that the Qinquan sect was safe. Everyone looked at Nie Tian in shock and couldn't help but whisper to each other, "He has completely recovered. This is unbelievable. His aura is even sharper than before. It looks like he is much stronger than before. This is too scary. He is only a heavenly charm holy disciple, but he has really absorbed the universal sword essence. The sword essence we felt just now, could it be related to the Master of the Sky?" The people discussed and looked at Nie Tian with complicated expressions. Among the shock, there was unconcealable fear. "I know that most of you don't admit that I am the Master of the Sky." Nie Tian glanced at the crowd and said in a deep voice, "I don't blame you because I know that I am too weak. I'm not the Master of the Sky that you all want to see. However, I will leave you with one sentence. The next time I appear in the Qinquan sect, I will show you the real Master of the Sky." Everyone was stunned when they heard his faint voice. Indeed, Nie Tian wasn't very strong, but his words were filled with a fierce aura that made people feel inexplicably shocked. "Senior, I will be leaving now." After saying that, Nie Tian turned around and said to Mo Yunfan, who was beside him, without looking at the crowd's reaction, "Now." Mo Yunfan was stunned. He didn't expect that Nie Tian would leave immediately. "Yes." Nie Tian nodded with a smile and said, "Staying here is just a waste of time. I have to improve my strength as soon as possible." Mo Yunfan could see the determination in Nie Tian's eyes and could only nod in agreement. It was indeed inappropriate for Nie Tian to stay after what had happened in the Qinquan sect. Nie Tian smiled faintly and reminded Duanmu Lu and the others again. He left some things for them, mainly the Fenghun sacred pill that Lung Shuang Wuchen had given him to Duanmu Lu for them to consume at the appropriate time. After that, Nie Tian bid farewell to Ing Sangxiong and the others and left without staying any longer. In the void, Nie Tian's figure quickly disappeared like a ray of light. "Master of the Sky, I believe that you will become the real Master of the Sky." Mo Yunfan looked at the place where Nie Tian had disappeared with a passionate look in his eyes. Chapter 36:44. Chapter 36:39. Chapter 36:39. You try. In the Cloud's Urge sacred world, two figures stood in the air above the Cosmos mountain range. They were precisely Nie Tian and Lan Zhuiying. After leaving the Qinquan Gate, Nie Tian followed the Qinquan mountain range all the way to the west. After a day, he finally crossed the Qinquan mountain range and arrived at the other side of the mountain range. At this moment, Nie Tianlong was hovering in the air. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised, and there was a somewhat strange smile on his face. "Nie Tian, what's wrong?" Lan Zhuiying's eyes flickered when she saw Nie Tian's reaction. "Come out." Nie Tian glanced at Lan Zhuiying and smiled strangely. After that, he looked at the void and shouted, Lan Zhuiying was stunned. She didn't know who Nie Tian was talking to. She didn't sense anything strange in the void. As the sound of Nie Tian's voice faded, The space in the distance trembled slightly as tens of black-robed silhouettes appeared. Each of them wore black robes that covered their faces. Their baleful auras towered up into the sky, and their eyes were filled with killing intent. When Lan Zhuing saw this, her pretty face froze, and she could not help but be stunned. She actually didn't realize that someone was following them. Following that, she seemed to have discovered something. Her expression suddenly changed, and her expression became a little strange. She seemed to be very flustered. Nie Tian glanced at Lan Zhuing and frowned. He then looked at the dozens of black-clothed cultivators and said, "We just came out of the Qinquan sect, and you have been following us for a whole day. Aren't you tired?" It turned out that when Nie Tian and Lan Zhuing left the Qinquan gate, this group of black-clothed men followed them. Nie Tian had noticed them a long time ago, but he didn't say anything until they reached the other side of the Qinquan mountain range. Initially, he thought that the group of men in black were coming for him, but now he realized that their target was Lan Zhuing. All the black-clad cultivators fixed their gazes on Lan Zhuing. Nie Tian guessed that these people should be guarding outside the Qinquan gate, waiting for them to leave. "Brat, this is a matter of our high paradise heavens. It has nothing to do with you. You can still make it if you leave now." At this moment, the leader of the black-clothed cultivators spoke coldly. A cold light flickered in his eyes. He had no interest in Nie Tian and was only here to capture Lan Zhuing. "Oh!" The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched. He smiled playfully and said, "I'm friend with Lan Zhuing. It's a bit hard for me to leave now." "Brat, do you know who she is?" The black-clothed man's eyes darkened, and he released a chill and killing intent at the same time. "I don't know anything else. All I know is that she's my friend." Nie Tian's lips twitched as he smiled faintly. This black-clothed man wasn't weak. He was a first-level heavenly righteousness saint. But such strength wasn't enough to make Nie Tian retreat. Nie Tian was confident that he might be able to fight with a first-level heavenly righteousness saint if he was in his peak condition. Most importantly, he couldn't leave without doing anything. Nie Tian leave. But at this moment, Lan Zhuing suddenly spoke. She looked at Nie Tian and said in a deep voice, "Do you really want me to leave? Or do you not want to implicate me?" Nie Tian's eyes narrowed as he looked straight at Lan Zhuing. Of course, he could see Lan Zhuing's helplessness. The latter was speaking against her will. Lan Zhuing's beautiful eyes flickered, and she didn't know what to say. "Lan Zhuing, you helped me once. This time, it's my turn to help you." Nie Tian smiled faintly. He then looked at the dozens of black-clothed martial artists and said loudly, "With me here, they won't be able to touch you. Is that so?" When the black-clothed man heard Nie Tian's words, he couldn't help but sneer. His eyes were cold and contemptuous. He took a step in the air and released a powerful aura. "I want to see what a mere holy disciple is capable of. How dare he say such big words?" It was obvious that this black-clothed man didn't understand Nie Tian at all. It was no wonder. They couldn't enter the Qinquan gate at all. Of course, they wouldn't know Nie Tian's true strength. "You could try." The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched as he looked at the powerful aura in the sky. A cold smile appeared on his face as a sword aura rose from his body. Like a huge sword, it shot up into the sky, majestic and powerful. Bang! The next moment, the two terrifying auras collided with each other. The air shook, and a muffled explosion was heard. The two auras collapsed at the same time. "Huh!" The black-clothed man was forced to take a few steps back. After he steadied himself, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. The way he looked at Nie Tian was filled with horror. He simply didn't dare to believe that Nie Tian actually broke through his oppressive aura so easily. He was a Lord Saint. When he released his aura, any martial artist below the 5th rank of the Heavenly Mandate Realm would be killed directly. But in front of him, a martial artist at the 8th rank of the Heavenly Mandate Realm had broken through his aura. How could he not be surprised? "Now do you know what I'm capable of?" Nie Tian smiled faintly. The corners of his mouth curled up into a cold, disdainful smile. "Son of a bitch, you're courting death." The black-clothed man's pupils suddenly constricted, and his face was extremely gloomy. He let out a wild roar, and the aura on his body rose to the limit. He took a step forward madly, and the space around him trembled. After that, he slapped out with his palm, and a boundless palm shadow appeared in the sky. It pressed down towards the heavens and the earth with the intention of killing Nietian. Nietian, watch out! Lan Zhuiying couldn't help but scream. She knew that Nietian's strength was insane. Martial artists of the same level couldn't be compared to him. But at this moment, Nietian was facing a saint of Tianyi. They weren't on the same level at all. Soul of the sky, open. Nietian sensed the immense pressure over his head. His eyes narrowed slightly, and without the slightest hesitation, he activated his Haotian soul. In the next moment, a terrifying force circulated throughout his body, instantly pushing his sword intent to the limit. 9 heavens of sword aura. The moment the soul of the sky was opened, Nietian's swordsmanship realm soared from the 4th heaven of sword aura to the 9th heaven of sword aura. The soul of the sky had just awakened. Nietian didn't even know what kind of power it was. However, when the soul of the sky was awakened, it swallowed the spirit of sky evolution and the spirit of Armageddon. Therefore, when it was opened, Nietian's swordsmanship realm soared to the 5th heaven. Sacred heaven defying sword. Unity of heaven and man. Sacrifice of the sun. In the next moment, Nietian let out a low roar without the slightest hesitation. Suddenly, sword intent surged out of his entire body. The clear sky, sword pierced the sky, and a sword shadow rumbled out. It was actually burning with flames, and it was wrapped in 9 different types of sword intent. The power of sword aura. Lan Zhuiying looked at the sword shadow in the air, and her beautiful eyes trembled. Nietian was too fierce. He gathered the power of 9 sword auras and went all out. Buzz! At this moment, the sword shadow shot up to the sky and a sword cry was heard. It had the power to pierce through the clouds and crack rocks. It seemed like it was going to destroy everything. Chapter 3645. 9 sword auras boom. In the void, the power of the 9 sword rhymes flowed on the sword shadow, pushing the power of the sword essence to the extreme. The sword shadow was like a roaring wild beast, streaking across the sky and directly attacking the huge palm shadow. Boom! In the next moment, the 2 forces, the palm and the sword, collided with each other. Heaven and earth roared, and a terrifying force erupted, turning into endless waves that spread in all directions. Wherever the waves passed, time and space became twisted and distorted. Retreat. The ferocious impact caused the eyes of the surrounding people to tremble. They cried out in shock and retreated. Who would have thought that a level 8 heavenly aura, holy disciple, would be able to unleash such a terrifying force in an instant? He was not weaker than their leader. This completely overturned their understanding of martial arts. They couldn't help but wonder if this silver-haired cultivator was really only at the level 8 heavenly aura, holy disciple. Just as everyone's eyes were trembling, something even more terrifying happened. Bang! High up in the sky, a terrifying force was unleashed, after which a deafening rumble rang out. The gigantic palm trembled violently in the air before it actually crumbled into pieces. Boom! In the next moment, the sword's shadow whistled violently and directly pressed towards the man in black. How can? The man in black was shocked. He was drowned in the sword aura before he could finish his sentence. The sword intent in the sky was boundless and chaotic. The man in black could not be seen at all. Lord Commander, when the other men in black saw this scene, their faces were filled with unconcealable fear. Their leader, the Tianyi Saint Monarch, had actually been killed by a heavenly charmed saint disciple. This scene was simply too shocking. Was it really not an illusion? This, Lan Zhuiying, who had already retreated tens of thousands of meters away, was also shocked by the scene in front of her. Her beautiful eyes trembled, and she was speechless. She couldn't believe that Nietian had actually become so powerful. When she first met Nietian in the wolf slave field, she could even suppress Nietian with her strength. However, it wasn't long before Nyation won first place in the Night of Wolf contest, crushing all the other geniuses. But now, Nyation had killed a Saint Monarch of heavenly justice with a single swing of his sword. In such a short time, Nyation's strength had skyrocketed. His growth was unbelievable. If she hadn't been by Nyation's side all this time, Lan Zhuiying would never have believed that someone could make such rapid progress. Nyation was a monster. At this moment, Nyation was floating in midair, his eyes grim and filled with killing intent. He didn't relax in the slightest. Since you're not dead, then get the fuck out here and continue fighting. Suddenly, his gaze sank, and he roared in a low voice that resounded through the clouds like a clap of thunder. Kid, you're not ordinary. The next moment, the sky shook slightly. The man in black appeared again. His eyes were dark to the extreme as he stared at Nyation. He didn't die. However, his injuries were very serious. His entire body was dripping with blood, and the bloody wounds were rolling up and down. One could clearly see the eerie white bones. Even though Nyation's sword strike hadn't killed him directly, it had severely injured him. He hid in the shadow of the sword and wanted to deal a fatal blow when Nyation lowered his guard. Unfortunately, he did not expect Nyation's perception to be so strong that he could discover him. You're not ordinary either. You're still half dead after taking a strike from me. Nyation's eyes darkened slightly. The corner of his mouth curled into a smile as he spoke with undisguised mockery. A saint of Tianyi was almost killed by a saint of Tianyi. This saint was indeed not ordinary. You. The man in black could hear the mockery in Nyation's tone. His pupils constricted, and his chi and blood surged as he spat out a mouthful of blood. Humph. Nyation chuckled as killing intent surged in his eyes. The man in black calmed down and said with a gloomy gaze, Kid, you used the power of 9 sword charms in that strike just now. You're not feeling good either, right? I'm feeling better than you. Nyation smiled faintly and replied coldly. Indeed, his martial body was under extreme pressure, and he had suffered some backlash. Compared to his previous state, he was indeed much weaker. Normally, a swordsman at the 9th heaven of sword charms would experience a long period of weakness after using the power of 9 sword charms. However, Nyation was only at the 4th heaven of sword charms. He relied on the soul of the sky to forcefully raise his sword realm to the 9th heaven. He could condense the power of 9 sword charms at the same time, which was already the limit of his sword principle. However, after using the power of 9 sword charms, his martial body would naturally suffer a great backlash. Fortunately, his martial body was far superior to warriors of the same level. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to even stand here. Brat, you still dare to be so stubborn. The man in black smiled coldly, then glanced behind him and said coldly, Kill him. This guy was obviously very afraid of Nyation. He didn't dare to continue fighting, so he sent his subordinates to do it. Yes, the several dozen black-clad cultivators answered in unison. Their auras were extremely strong, causing the surrounding space to tremble. Nyation's eyes narrowed, and his expression changed. These warriors in black were not weak. They were all heavenly mandate Saint Masters. The weakest was at the 5th heaven of the heavenly mandate realm, and the strongest was at the 9th heaven of the heavenly mandate realm. With Nyation's current strength, he could fight against the 9th heaven of the heavenly mandate realm Saint Master had on. However, dozens of heavenly mandate Saint Masters joined forces. The kind of pressure was something that even Saint Lord Tianyi would find difficult to resist. Kill. At that moment, the dozens of black-robed men let out angry roars at the same time. Instantly, the void around them shook violently as a vast, boundless force appeared and fell from the sky like an avalanche, causing the void to rumble as it pressed down on Nyation. Nyation, Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes trembled. Her pretty face changed, and she cried out in shock. The combined attack of dozens of men in black was even more terrifying than the palm attack from Saint Lord Tianyi. The momentum of the surrounding space was forcibly changed under the pressure of this power. The world seemed to be collapsing in an instant. Sword matrix in the sky. Open. Nietian felt the terrifying pressure coming from the sky. His eyes narrowed, and a cold light surged. With a thought, the sword in the sky was suddenly raised and pierced into the sky. Suddenly, the vast and boundless power of the sword matrix was released. It was like a raging river, and its majestic momentum washed away everything. The dozens of men in black felt the terrifying sword momentum coming from the space. Their expressions changed, and they all cried out in surprise. Chapter 36:46. Time to get lost. How is this possible? The leader of the black-robed men looked at the scene in the sky. His cloudy eyes trembled, and he couldn't help but scream in horror. He simply couldn't believe that the sword formation Nietian had unleashed in a split second was actually so terrifyingly powerful. Normally speaking, sword formations could appear in the sword techniques that swordsmen practiced. When swordsmen fought, they could use sword formations as well as sword techniques. However, although that kind of sword formation was more powerful than sword moves, it was much weaker than a normal sword formation. But at this moment, when Nietian stabbed out with his sword, the power of the sword formation roared into the sky. It had the momentum to swallow the clouds and swallow the moon. It was too terrifying. Boom! Rumble, rumble, rumble. In the next instant, the imposing aura collided with the sword formation, causing a thunderous sound to ring out. After which, the space around them trembled as a boundless amount of energy transformed into boundless waves of qi, destroying everything in its path. Nietian's eyes narrowed slightly. Feeling the terrible impact, he made a prompt decision. Wings of astral soul appeared on his back, and his figure shot out like a sword. At the same time, dozens of black-robed warriors also felt that something was wrong and retreated frantically. But their reaction was obviously much slower than Nietian's, and their speed wasn't as fast as Nietian's. Many people couldn't avoid the impact of the waves and were instantly submerged. Boom, 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 whoosh, whoosh, whoosh up in the sky, the rumbling continued. The world was chaotic, dark clouds rolled, and time and space were overturned. It was extremely terrifying. The leader of the black-robed men and Lan Zhuiying stared at the terrifying void with trembling eyes. Their expressions were completely lifeless. They couldn't imagine how Nietian, who looked so ordinary, could resist the joint attack of dozens of high-level Heavenly Mandate Realm Saint Masters with his cultivation at the 8th level of Heavenly Yun. Nietian was too terrifying. Bang, bang, bang. After a long time, a series of muffled sounds came from the void, and a dozen figures were sent flying, leaving bloody trails in the air. Nietian, on the other hand, took a step forward and stood firmly in midair like a sharp sword, emanating a fierce aura. However, his complexion was not good. It was as pale as paper, and there were several bloody wounds on his body that dyed half of his body red. Releasing the sword formation in the sky, coupled with the terrifying impact, caused his martial body to bear even more pressure. At this moment, his body was already extremely weak. The sword formation in the sky had previously absorbed the power of the Koan sword. However, due to the impact of the Qian sword, the two forces actually canceled each other out. Therefore, the power of the sword formation that Nietian released was drawn by himself. It was equivalent to the power of the sword intent that he had accumulated over the past few days. The power of these sword wills, together with the power of the sword matrix in the sky, was able to block the joint attack of dozens of divine masters of the Heavenly Mandate Realm. If the power of the Qian Koan sword had not been canceled out, the sword formation in the sky would have erupted instantly. Even hundreds or thousands of divine masters of the Heavenly Mandate Realm would not have been able to resist it. However, Nietian found that the stronger the power that was activated in the sword formation in the sky, the stronger the pressure on his martial body when it erupted in an instant. Moreover, the sword formations that had already been activated needed much less sword wills to be activated again. Fortunately, there was the sword formation in the sky. Otherwise, he would have been killed by the joint attack of dozens of men in black. How is this possible? The leader of the men in black looked at the scene in front of him. The shock in his heart was written all over his face. His eyes trembled in disbelief. In the battle just now, more than half of the dozens of warriors in black had died. Only a dozen were still alive, and all of them were seriously injured. How could the leader of the men in black have imagined that the silver-haired warrior who followed Lan Zhuiying was so abnormal? The leader of the men in black forced himself to calm down. His eyes trembled as he looked at Nie Tian and asked in shock, "Kid, what kind of sword is that in your hand?" He had already discovered that the sword formation just now did not come from Nie Tian himself, but from the sword in his hand. However, the aura of the sword had merged with Nie Tian's, and it was very much like the sword of the primordial spirit. However, he had never seen anyone's sword of the primordial spirit be so strong. "Do you have a right to know?" The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched. His eyes were cold and murderous. He growled directly, "Before I'm completely angry, get lost. Get lost. Get lost. Get lost." His last voice was like 10,000 claps of thunder, bombarding the ears of the men in black. It made their hearts tremble inexplicably. They could not help but take a few steps back, and they were almost unable to stand. "Kid, do you know who we are?" The eyes of the leader of the men in black suddenly shrank as he asked in a low voice. "Is that important?" Nie Tianling smiled coldly in an extremely arrogant manner. "You?" The expression of the leader of the men in black stiffened, and he was momentarily speechless. Today, this young martial artist in front of him had simply smashed his martial Dao dignity to the point where it was completely bruised and battered. "Your Highness, are you really not going to leave with us?" At that moment, the leader of the men in black suddenly looked at Lan Zhuiying. His eyes trembled slightly as he asked in a deep voice, "You can leave." Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes trembled slightly. After a moment of silence, she raised her head and said, her brows were tightly knitted together, and her pretty face was very unpleasant, as if she was hiding deep worry and fear. The fear made her look pitiful, and it was heartbreaking. "Your Highness, you should understand that you can't escape from your mission." The leader of the men in black did not give up. He said, "If you don't leave with us, the next person who comes looking for you will not be from the realm of high paradise. I know what I'm doing. I don't need you to remind me." Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes darkened as she spoke coldly. "Your Highness, the people from the realm of evil won't." The leader of the men in black frowned. His expression suddenly changed, and he could not hide his panic. "Don't mention the realm of evil to me." Before the leader of the men in black could finish speaking, Lan Zhuiying suddenly screamed. Her voice was extremely sharp, and her eyes were bloodshot. She seemed very agitated. "Your Highness." The leader of the men in black frowned and hesitated for a moment. His eyes suddenly swept across Nie Tian, and he said, "I'll ask one last time. Is this kid the person you've chosen? Don't tell me this." I don't know. Lan Zhuiying suddenly screamed as if she had gone mad. "Your Highness." The leader of the men in black's expression darkened, and he was about to say something else. Boom! However, at that moment, Nie Tian took a step forward and unleashed his sword aura in a frenzy, which caused the air to tremble. "All of you get lost." Nie Tian's face darkened as he spoke coldly. His aura was extremely sharp. "Let's go." The leader of the men in black's eyes darkened as he sensed the threat. He glanced at Lan Zhuiying again before he let out a roar and left. The cultivators of the realm of high paradise instantly left, and their figures soon disappeared. Puff! As soon as the men in black left, Nie Tian's body trembled violently, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. Lan Zhuiying's expression changed when she saw the situation. She moved toward Nie Tian and asked nervously, "Nie Tian, are you all right?" At that moment, Nie Tian's gaze sharpened, and his pale face changed again. A hint of fear had appeared on his face. Chapter 36:47. Two fugitives. Yinyang baleful chi. Old man Yinyang, Zhou Yinshan. Nie Tian's pupils shrank, and his expression flickered with astonishment. This was because he sensed an extremely strong killing intent from the yin and yang chi. Tian, what's wrong? Lan Zhuying's expression changed as she looked at Tian. Old man Yinyang, since you're here, why don't you show yourself? Tian's expression sank as he looked at the void. Zhou Yinshan, Lan Zhuiying's eyes flickered as she exclaimed in surprise. She raised her head and followed Tian's line of sight. The void trembled slightly as a familiar figure appeared. It was old man Yinyang, Zhou Yinshan. Tian, your perception is really beyond my expectations. Zhou Yinshan's lips curled up. His face was even more feminine than a woman's, and it was extremely gloomy and cold. Is that so? Tian's lips twitched as he braced himself and shielded Lan Zhuiying behind him. Lan Zhuiying's eyes flickered as she wore a confused expression. She could sense a strong killing intent from Zhou Yinshan's body. She did not expect Zhou Yinshan to suddenly appear at this moment. Zhou Yinshan let out a sinister laugh. His gaze shifted to Lan Zhuiying, and he said, Your Highness, it's been a while. Zhou Yinshan, why are you here? Lan Zhuiying's eyes sank as she asked in a cold tone. She thought that Zhou Yinshan had left after they left the sacred world of seventh cultivators. However, it seemed that Zhou Yinshan had come to the vertical cloud sacred world with them. What's wrong? Is your Highness not happy to see me? Zhou Yinshan smiled cold with a playful look on his face. Impudent. Lan Zhuiying's expression turned cold as she shouted, How dare you call yourself me in front of me? I didn't dare in the past, but now, humph. Zhou Yinshan sneered. He paused for a moment and said, Your Highness, if I'm not mistaken, you escaped from the High Paradise, right? Based on your current identity, you should be a fugitive of the High Paradise heavens, right? Zhou Yinshan, what do you mean by that? Lan Zhuiying growled in a low voice, but her expression was one of panic. Does your Highness not know what I mean? Zhou Yinshan sneered and asked, Your Highness, you are now a fugitive just like me. However, I'm about to do something big for the High Paradise heavens. Perhaps Master will allow me to rejoin the High Paradise heavens out of respect for the Saintess. Zhou Yinshan was indeed a cultivator from the High Paradise sky. However, he was a traitor of the High Paradise sky. During this period of defecting, Zhou Yinshan had been constantly thinking about returning to the High Paradise. And now his chance had come. Lan Zhuiying looked at Zhou Yinshan and suddenly thought of something. Her beautiful eyes trembled, and she was so shocked that she could not speak. Your Highness, whether or not I can return to the High Paradise heavens depends on you. Zhou Yinshan sneered. His male and female voices intertwined, making him look extremely evil. You want to capture me and bring me back? Lan Zhuiying's expression changed, and she cried out in shock. Your Highness, I'm sorry. Zhou Yinshan smiled cold. He looked at Lan Zhuiying with a burning gaze, like a wolf looking at a little lamb. That's right. He wanted to capture Lan Zhuiying and bring her back to the High Paradise heavens. The Saintess of the High Paradise heavens was, of course, more important than a small fry like him. He believed that as long as he could capture Lan Zhuiying and bring her back to the High Paradise heavens, he would definitely be able to rejoin the High Paradise heavens. I followed all of you and joined the High Paradise heavens. It took me a lot of effort to find all of you again. Zhou Yinshan smiled coldly and said, Sure enough, the yellow heaven has no mercy for those who keep their hearts to themselves. My adventure was not in vain. Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, he took a step forward, and a terrifying yin-yang evil qi gushed out. The space within a radius of tens of thousands of meters was instantly filled with the yin-yang evil qi, and it was suffocating. Yet Tian's brow furrowed, and his pale face turned even more unsightly. With his current condition, it was too much for him to bear such a heavy yin-yang evil qi. Seeing that Tian was about to collapse, Lan Zhuiying quickly stepped forward and supported him. Tian. Zhou Yinshan looked at Tian with a cold smirk and said, Tian, your strength has indeed exceeded my expectations. Fortunately, I didn't show up just now. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have died in your hands. He had watched the battle between Tian and the group of men in black from the beginning to the end, and he was deeply shocked by Nie Tian's strength. He could not imagine how Nie Tian could be so powerful. Young old man, do you think I can't kill you now? Nie Tian forcefully stabilized his body and said with a cold smile. His eyes were shining with a cold light, and he looked extremely fierce. I guess you've used up all your trump cards. Zhou Yinshan's eyes darkened, and he said, You're just bluffing now. He did not believe that Nie Tian still had the strength to fight him at this moment. However, in his heart, he was indeed a little afraid. This was because Nie Tian was too strange, and he could not be treated as an ordinary martial artist. Faintly, he was worried that Nie Tian still had more powerful techniques that he had not used. With a faint smile, Nie Tian said, Why don't you give it a try? His eyes were as deep as an abyss, filled with endless darkness. Very well. I'd like to see what other strength you have. Zhou Yinshan was stunned for a moment, and then he spoke in a sharp and piercing voice, making him look extremely fierce. Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, Zhou Yinshan's body shook, and the yin and yang evil qi surged out, turning into two terrifying forces. One was white, one was black, one was yin, and one was yang. They were extremely powerful, and the surrounding space began to tremble. I'd like to see how you, who are seriously injured, can fight me. Zhou Yinshan let out a low roar, and suddenly, the yin and yang extreme force roared out, forming a storm of evil qi in the air. It released a terrifying strangling force, and it blasted towards Nie Tian. Nie Tian's eyes darkened, and without hesitation, his eyes changed in an instant. They were as dark as the abyss, and a terrifying power was released, circulating throughout his body, pushing his martial body to its limit. The godly demon body was activated again. Sacred heaven-defying sword, unity of heaven and man, Yang's sacrifice. In the next instant, Nie Tian swung the sky sword in his hand again, and the sword radiance was like a waterfall, crashing into the surrounding space. A huge sword shadow appeared, and it roared like a dragon as it charged forward. In order to fight against Zhou Yinshan, Nie Tian could only forcefully activate the godly demon body while he was seriously injured. Chapter 3648. Extreme Tenacity. Zhou Yinshan could feel the crazy aura coming from Nie Tian. His eyes flickered, and he couldn't help but be surprised. However, in the next moment, he started to laugh coldly and madly. Nie Tian, you're still able to explode with such power when you're on the brink of death. It's really beyond my expectations. Unfortunately, such power isn't enough to fight against me. Boom! In the next instant, the two terrifying forces clashed together. The shadow of the sword was like a dragon, forcefully breaking through the storm of baleful qi. In an instant, an endless amount of violent waves erupted in the air, rushing in all directions. Bang! Immediately after, a muffled sound rang out as a bloody figure was sent flying. A trail of blood appeared in the air as the stench of blood filled the air. Nie Tian. Lan Jing saw that the blood-colored figure was Nie Tian, and her eyes trembled as she cried out. And at this moment, a pair of astral soul wings appeared on Nie Tian's back, allowing him to stabilize his body. His entire body was drenched in blood, and his face was deathly pale and emaciated, looking extremely terrifying. Don't come over. Nie Tian suddenly waved his hand, signaling Lan Jing to stay away. At this time, although Lan Jing was already a Saint Master in the second tier of the Heavenly Mandate Realm, she could not intervene at all in the battle between Nie Tian and Zhou Yinshan. Once she did, she would become a burden to Nie Tian. Zhou Yinshan took a step forward and said in a cold tone, Your Highness, I think you should step aside and watch. He still needed to capture Lan Jing and bring her back to claim his reward. Of course, he didn't want her to get hurt. Lan Jing's eyes trembled, and she finally retreated to the side. Nie Tian steadied himself. His eyes were as dark as the night as they locked on Zhou Yin as he said in a cold tone, Young old man, you're only a so-so. You can't even kill me in my current state. At this time, he was already at the limit of his martial body and could collapse at any time. Nie Tian in the demon body state was originally very strong, but in the battle just now, he had used the power of the 9-sword rhymes and the counterattack of the sword matrix in the sky, and he was already severely injured. At this moment, activating the demon body state again was a heavy pressure on him. It was already very difficult for him to still be standing. Nie Tian, you're the scariest person I've ever met in my life. Zhou Yinshan's eyes trembled as he said coldly, "If you were at the same cultivation level as me, I would definitely be no match for you. But now old man, you will die in. You. Shun 2-1. Old 3 old man. 2 old man. Yin Lien Tian on demon, I demon, Tian Lien Tian 4th. Colon 1, Tian Tian Jojo, Dong Tijo Tianjo, Tianten, Jojo Li 1 T1. Nie Tian's strength is really beyond imagination. Zhou Yin wondered how terrifying Nie Tian would be when he advanced to the 3rd stage of the Supreme Saint Realm. Zhou Yinshan had a feeling that if Nie Tian could grow up in the future, he would definitely be a person who could topple the holy world. Is that so? Nie Tianling smirked as a cold glint flashed in his eyes. At this moment, he was indeed at his limit. What was worse was that his Black Tortoise Star Soul and Earthly Destruction Star Soul had not recovered and could not be used. If he wanted to defeat Zhou Yinshan, he could only rely on himself. Nie Tian, you're still so stubborn even when you're at death's door. I have to look at you in a different light. Zhou Yinshan let out a cold laugh as killing intent burst out of his body. Yin and Yang killing chi surged out of his body and formed a storm of killing chi in the air, which crushed down on Nie Tian. Boom! The yin-yang evil chi surged as if thousands of demons were dancing, suppressing and devouring everything. Nie Tian's face darkened when he felt the strangling power in the air. His body trembled, and the 9 dragon veins in his body began to revolve. A majestic dragon aura was released, and the power of lightning surged violently, causing the air to roar. Roar! In the next instant, a giant red dragon appeared in the endless sea of dragon chi. It was tens of thousands of meters long, and the power of lightning surged on its body like a lightning net. Buzz! The giant dragon rolled its body and charged toward the evil chi storm. Under the pressure of the terrifying power, the air let out a dull sound as if it was about to collapse. This! Lan Zhuiying's eyes trembled when she saw this. She was dumbfounded and did not know how to express the shock in her heart. Under such circumstances, Nie Tian was actually tenacious to such an extent. It was simply too terrifying. Boom! Boom! The giant dragon soared into the sky and collided with the evil chi storm. Suddenly, the air roared and the earth trembled. The violent power exploded and wreaked havoc in the air. Chi, chi, chi. The evil chi storm and the lightning dragon fought against each other, and ear-piercing sounds could be heard. The body of the giant dragon could not withstand the strangling power of the evil chi and began to crumble. Rumble. Following that, a terrifying power started to surge out. Dragon chi and baleful chi clashed together, causing the void to start to crack. Waves of space-time storms surged out, causing the originally chaotic space-time to become even more chaotic. Nie Tian, is this your last counterattack? You're too weak. Zhou Yinshan said in a low voice from high up in the sky. His thunderous voice resounded in the air. He could not see Nie Tian at all, but he was confident. As long as Nie Tian appeared, he would be able to kill him with one palm. He knew that the dragon he had just unleashed was Nie Tian's last move. He had already won the battle. Is that so? However, before he could finish his sentence, a low voice sounded in the chaotic time and space. In the endless waves, a blood-red figure appeared. Nie Tian. Zhou Yinshan's expression changed. He saw that Nie Tian had appeared less than 100 meters away from him and shouted in shock. He could not imagine how Nie Tian could withstand the impact of the evil chi and not die. At this time and space were collapsing. Waves of space and time storms fell, but were blocked by a space-time shield around Nie Tian's body. The dragon chi weakened the stability of time and space, causing time and space to collapse. The clash between the dragon chi and the evil chi also weakened the evil chi. Nie Tian used the boundary of the universe to form a space-time shield and rushed over to give Zhou Lianshan a fatal blow. Zhou Lianshan, this battle is over. At this time, the corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched. Two extreme demon marks appeared in the corner of his eyes, and two extremely dark eye powers surged out and instantly attacked Zhou Lianshan. Puffed. Zhou Lianshan's pupils constricted. Before he could react, his chest and neck were pierced through. He felt warm blood gushing out. He instinctively covered his chest and neck, tried to stop it. However, it was too late. His eyes trembled as he stared at Nie Tian with incomparable astonishment. He wanted to say something, but couldn't utter a single sound after opening his mouth. Chapter 36:49. 4 days and 4 nights. In the chaotic void, all kinds of terrifying powers were wreaking havoc. Nie Tian stood in the void like a statue, not moving at all. In his extreme state, he had used 2 extreme demon annihilation seals to instantly kill Yin-Yang Grandmaster Zhou Lianshan. In the 7th sacred world of cultivators, Zhou Lianshan was definitely an expert who stood at the peak. With his strength, even in the Zongyun sacred world, he would still be an expert. However, in the end, he died at the hands of Nie Tian. Before he died, he did not understand why Nie Tian was so terrifying. How could one not sigh when a dignified expert of a sacred world ended up like this? After a long time, the violent power in the void gradually dissipated and Nie Tian's figure gradually became clear. Lan Zhuiying's eyes were trembling uncontrollably, as if she was still in a state of shock and was unable to react. At this moment, she suddenly saw Nie Tian's figure clearly. Her eyes suddenly narrowed and she cried out, "Nie Tian!" However, at this moment, Nie Tian's body suddenly trembled. Then, like a stone, he fell straight down. Nie Tian! Lan Zhuiying's expression changed. Her figure moved like a ray of light. She instantly flashed over and caught Nie Tian. She sensed Nie Tian's aura. It was extremely weak and intermittent, as if it could disappear at any time. Her heart sank, and her pretty face became very nervous. Let's leave this place first. Lan Zhuiying forced herself to calm down. She felt that there were still some space-time turbulences in the void. She did not dare to delay and directly left. 3 days later, in a valley in the Qinquan mountain range, Nie Tian was lying on the ground. His closed eyes suddenly moved. Nie Tian! Lan Zhuiying, who had been guarding him all this time, couldn't help but cry out in pleasant surprise. At this moment, Nie Tian's eyes opened slightly and his blurry vision gradually cleared up. A delicate and pretty face appeared in front of him. His lips twitched as he murmured, "Rushi." Rushi? Hearing this name, Lan Zhuiying couldn't help but stare blankly. With an awkward expression, she said, "Nie Tian, I am Lan Zhuiying." However, at this time, Nie Tian's consciousness didn't seem to be fully awake. He closed his eyes again. Lan Zhuiying frowned slightly. She released waves of sword will from her body and enveloped Nie Tian. She used the sword will of heaven and earth as a sword spirit to protect and nourish Nie Tian. Just like that, another day passed. Nie Tian finally opened his eyes again, and his consciousness was much clearer. Nie Tian, you're finally awake. Lan Zhuiying sensed that Nie Tian's aura was very stable. Her tense nerves finally relaxed a little. Nie Tian opened his eyes. The murkiness in his eyes slowly dissipated and was replaced by a sharp light. "I'm fine." He exhaled a long breath of foul air, and with Lan Zhuiying's help, he sat up and said with a faint smile, "Thank you very much." Lan Zhuiying's face was a little pale. After confirming that Nie Tian was really fine, she smiled and said, "You were injured like this because of me. The one who should say thank you is me." Nie Tian nodded and didn't say anything. At this moment, his divine sense was completely awake, but his martial body was still very weak. Even the slightest movement of his body was accompanied by an extremely intense, tearing pain. It was as if his entire body would be torn apart in an instant. However, his aura had stabilized. The 9 dragon veins began to circulate slowly, releasing the aura of life to nourish his martial body. Under these circumstances, he would be able to return to normal in a few days. The battle with Zhou Lianshan and the others had injured him too badly. Most importantly, he had activated too much forbidden power, which made his martial body unable to bear it. The main reason he had been injured so badly was because of the backlash of his own power. This time, he had been unconscious for 4 days and 4 nights. He had experienced countless battles of life and death, but this could be considered the most serious injury he had ever suffered. Even when he had fought the soul-splitting wolf in the forbidden area of the Dragon Rebel clan, he hadn't been so badly injured. The key was that the opponents he had faced this time were too strong. There were 2 Saint Tianni and dozens of high-level heavenly mandate Saint Masters. Even some of the stronger Saint Tianni would find it hard to deal with such a lineup. Tian was only a Saint Master in the 8th tier of heavenly rhythm. It was already a miracle that he could survive in front of such powerful opponents. Tian, it's all thanks to this little girl that you survived this time. At this moment, the Ghost Emperor's voice was heard. She used her own sword will to nourish your martial body and soul for 4 days and 4 nights. That's why you were able to survive. The Ghost Emperor's voice was low, and there was lingering fear in his voice. This time, it was really too dangerous. It was one of the few times that Tian had been close to death. Lan Zhuiying, thank you so much. Tian nodded slightly and looked at Lan Zhuiying, expressing his sincere gratitude. Tian, I should be the one thanking you. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I would have been captured and sent back to the blissful realm. Lan Zhuiying's eyes flickered and she nodded. Her eyes were trembling, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't want to. Tian nodded slightly and didn't say anything else. Right now, what he needed the most was to rest. Afterward, Tian and Lan Zhuiying didn't say anything else. They cultivated and recovered. In the blink of an eye, 3 days passed. Tian stood up. His aura was extremely sharp, and it was much stronger than before. He had walked back from the edge of life and death. In just 10 days, his martial body had mostly recovered. If it were any other cultivator at the same level as him, they would have to rest for years or even decades to recover from such an injury. From this, one could see how strong Tian's martial body was. It was too dangerous this time. Looks like I need to prepare more trump cards in case of emergencies. Tian's lips twitched as he thought to himself. The enemy he faced this time was too strong. This was one of the reasons why he was in danger. Another reason was that he didn't use his power to its fullest. If the destructive Earth Star Soul and the Black Tortoise Star Soul were activated, he wouldn't be in such a difficult situation. For the next period of time, Tian didn't plan to leave immediately. He planned to cultivate in the valley for about a month and activate the sword formation in the sky and the destructive Earth Black Tortoise Star Souls. However, he didn't plan to inscribe a powerful sword formation in the sky. Previously, when he released the sword formation in the sky, he realized that the stronger the sword formation in the sky, the greater the pressure on his martial body when he released it. Therefore, if the sword formation in the sky was too powerful, it would be troublesome. Tian. At this time, Lan Zhuiying also stood up and looked at Tian. Her eyes flickered and she wanted to say something but stopped. What's wrong? Tian turned to look at Lan Zhuiying and smiled. Chapter 3650. The Entanglement of Fate in the Valley. Lan Zhuiying stared at Tian with trembling eyes. She seemed a little nervous. Why do I have to ask? Tian asked with a faint smile. Aren't you curious? Lan Zhuiying was taken aback for a moment. Her nervousness instantly weakened as she asked with a frown. Tian had almost lost his life trying to stop the people from the blissful sky from capturing her. However, Tian did not ask anything, which made her feel very strange. I'm curious. Tian smiled and said, but this is your own matter after all. I'm helping you because you're my friend. Moreover, if you want to tell me, you'll tell me even if I don't ask. If you don't want to tell me, it'll be useless even if I ask. You, Lan Zhuiying's eyes trembled. She seemed a little anxious and could not speak for a moment. He hadn't expected that Nie Tian would come up with such a theory, which, although strange, made sense after giving it some thought. So, Your Highness, do you want to tell me why the people from the blissful sky want to capture you? Nie Tian asked with a smile as he looked at Lan Zhuiying. Lan Zhuiying's eyes narrowed, and she seemed a little embarrassed. She thought about it, and finally said, "You already know that my real identity is the blissful sky's saintess." Yes. Nie Tian nodded and waited for Lan Zhuiying to continue. The blissful sky is the strongest force in the mid-level sacred world, the blissful world. Their overall strength is much stronger than the Qinquan sect. Lan Zhuiying's eyes darkened, and she said, "The Yin-Yang old man, Zhou Yinshan, who died in your hands, was a traitor who was expelled from the blissful sky a long time ago. His position in the blissful sky is at most a mid-level cultivator." Yes. Nie Tian nodded again and agreed with her. Lan Zhuiying was right. The pure paradise was indeed stronger than the Qinquan sect. In the entire Qinquan sect, there shouldn't be many Saint Lord Tianyi experts. However, Zhou Yinshan could be considered a middle-level warrior in the Heavens of Bliss. This undoubtedly meant that there were many Lord Tianyi warriors in the Heavens of Bliss. I'm the High Paradise Heavens Saintess, and my position in the entire High Paradise Heavens is second only to Reverend High Paradise. Lan Zhuiying continued as a strange light flashed in her eyes, as if she was recalling many things. Nie Tian's eyes flickered with a burning desire. He was very curious as to why Lan Zhuiying, who had such a high status, had become a fugitive of the High Paradise realm. Although I am the holy daughter of the High Paradise Heavens, I also carry a mission from the High Paradise Heavens. At this moment, Lan Zhuiying's expression became very unsightly. She said, "It was precisely because I didn't want to carry out that mission that I escaped from the High Paradise and became a fugitive there." "What mission?" Nie Tian could not help but ask with a frown. "The Heaven of Evil." Lan Zhuiying fell silent for a moment before uttering a name in a deep voice. Nie Tian frowned as he did not quite understand. Previously, he had heard the name of the Heaven of Evil from the High Paradise Heavens commander. It sounded like a certain force, and it should be related to the High Paradise Heavens. The Heaven of Evil is a force from another sacred world, and it has a very close relationship with the High Paradise Heavens. Lan Zhuiying's pretty face was gloomy as she said, "There's an ancient rule between the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens called the entanglement of fate. When the time is right, the High Paradise Heavens Saintess will marry the holy son of the High Paradise Heavens. The two great forces call this marriage the union of fate. The two great forces continue the entanglement of fate through the union of fate." At this point, Lan Zhuiying fell silent and did not speak for a long time. "So, you left the High Paradise Heavens because you didn't want to marry the holy son of the High Paradise Heavens, and you're running away from the marriage?" Nie Tian asked with a frown. "Yes." Lan Zhuiying nodded solemnly. Her eyes flickered incessantly, as if there was something she wanted to say. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed as he looked at Lan Zhuiying and asked, "That's not all, right?" Knowing Lan Zhuiying's character, it was not enough to force her out of the High Paradise Heavens just by marrying someone. Moreover, Nie Tian could tell that Lan Zhuiying had a deep bond with the High Paradise Heavens. It seemed like there was more to this marriage that was called the union of fate. The holy son of the High Paradise Heavens is... Lan Zhuiying fell silent for a long time before she finally opened her mouth and said in a deep voice, "He's my elder brother." "Elder brother?" Nie Tian's eyes flickered. He was stunned and could not react for a long time. He did not expect that the person who was going to marry Lan Zhuiying was her elder brother. But how is this possible? Since the entanglement of fate was an ancient rule that the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens followed, why would the Holy Daughter of Happiness and the Holy Son of Evil be siblings? Could it be that the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens didn't know about the relationship between Lan Zhuiying and the Holy Son of Evil? Lan Zhuiying looked at Nie Tian and guessed what he was thinking. She said in a deep voice, They already knew about my bloodline relationship with the Holy Son of Evil. They already knew about it. Tian was stunned. His face sank, and he asked, "Then why did they arrange it like this?" They already knew about the relationship between the two of them, yet they still wanted them to get married. Wasn't this forcing them to go against the heavenly Tao? The High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens' actions were truly infuriating and incomprehensible. The High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens believe in the same principle. Only those who are entangled for eternity will become siblings in this life. Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes flickered. Her expression was extremely unsightly, and her eyes were filled with despair. What *T principle? Tian's eyes narrowed as he let out a low roar and cursed. Forcing people to go against the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens were simply evil sects. No wonder Lan Zhuiying would leave the High Paradise Heavens. The Holy Son and Holy Daughter of the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens have always been siblings. Lan Zhuiying's expression turned ugly as she said, "In the past, there were people who resisted, but those holy sons and holy daughters who resisted were either killed or tortured to death. All of them ended up in a tragic end." Lan Zhuiying's eyes were trembling. She knew that the High Paradise Heavens and the High Paradise Heavens were too powerful. In her eyes, they were like two unshakable mountains, and her resistance seemed so insignificant, even a little ridiculous. Just because they're miserable doesn't mean you're miserable. Tian looked at Lan Zhuiying with a sharp gaze as he said in a deep voice, "If you're willing to resist until the end, you'll definitely succeed." Definitely succeed? Upon hearing Tian's words, Lan Zhuiying was taken aback. Her pretty face flickered slightly, and her pupils shrank. She saw an extreme determination in Tian's eyes, a stubbornness that would never yield. Chapter 36:51. Brand of Extreme Happiness. Tian, I believe in you. Lan Zhuiying looked at Tian and could feel the confidence in his eyes. She couldn't help but be moved and couldn't help but say this. "You don't have to believe in me, but yourself." Tian smiled faintly and said calmly, Lan Zhuiying's eyes flickered and she nodded heavily. It seemed that after seeing the look in Tian's eyes, she suddenly felt that the experts of the realm of High Paradise and the realm of 10,000 evils weren't as terrifying as she had imagined. At this time, Tian suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but ask, "Lan Zhuiying, the commander of the realm of High Paradise said that I'm the person you've chosen. What did he mean by that?" Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes flickered when she heard Tian's question. She hesitated for a long time and said hesitantly, "Can I not say it?" "Of course you can. I was just asking casually." Tian smiled faintly and didn't pursue the matter. He could see that Lan Zhuiying seemed to have something that was difficult to say. He never forced people. Since the other party wasn't willing to say it, he wouldn't ask anymore. "Lan Zhuiying, you were originally in the middle grade sacred world, the realm of High Paradise. Why did you come to the seventh cultivator of true virtue?" Tian's eyes slightly narrowed, and he asked, "To avoid the pursuit of the realm of High Paradise." Lan Zhuiying's eyes were gloomy as she said, "I left the realm of High Paradise for 3 years and went to many elementary sacred worlds. I had to travel back and forth between different sacred worlds. Otherwise, the people of the realm of High Paradise would quickly find me." "Why?" Tian frowned and couldn't help but ask. In his opinion, it wasn't easy to find a cultivator in the same sacred world or even in the same city. Moreover, Lan Zhuiying had traversed through many holy realms, so how had the people from the High Paradise been able to find her? "I have a brand of bliss on me. No matter where I am, the people from the sky of bliss will find me." Lan Zhuiying's beautiful eyes flickered as she spoke in a deep voice. "The brand of bliss?" Tian frowned, and his expression changed. His divine sense moved and carefully sensed Lan Zhuiying's body, but he couldn't sense any abnormal aura, which made him feel very strange. Since the aura of the brand of bliss could cross the barrier of the sacred world, it should be an extremely terrifying spiritual imprint. However, Tian did not sense any abnormal divine soul aura. You can't sense the brand of bliss. Lan Zhuing looked at Tian and said in a deep voice, "The mark of bliss was engraved into my spirit when I was born. It has completely integrated with my spirit. What you can sense is only the aura of my spirit." So that's how it is. Tian's face darkened. He asked, "Then how do the people from the sky of bliss sense the brand of bliss?" "The sky of bliss has a great formation of bliss that can sense the aura of any brand of bliss," Lan Zhuing said with a dark face. Tian's face darkened. He remained silent for a very long time. It was no wonder that the people from the sky of bliss were able to chase her all the way to the Cloud's Urge sacred world. It seemed like Lan Zhuing had a rough time in the past 3 years. She had been constantly hiding from their pursuers. It was very difficult to imagine how she managed to last until now with her strength. "Doesn't that mean you'll have to constantly move through the sacred world and live an uncertain life?" Tian frowned and said in a deep voice, "In this man-eating world, who doesn't live an uncertain life?" Lan Zhuing smiled bitterly inside. Tian's eyes narrowed. He could not help but fall silent. Ever since he had been reborn, hadn't he also been living an uncertain life? After a while, Tian's eyes trembled. He looked at Lan Zhuing and asked, "Is there a way to remove the brand of bliss?" Lan Zhuing shook her head and sighed. "The brand of bliss has long since fused into one with my soul. It's almost impossible to strip it away." Tian's face darkened. He was momentarily speechless. If the brand of bliss could be removed so easily, Lan Zhuing would not have been wandering around. "Tian, perhaps this emperor knows someone who can remove the brand of bliss." The ghost emperor's voice suddenly rang out. It was filled with excitement. "Where is that person?" Tian furrowed his brows, and his eyes shone with undisguised joy. This emperor knew that person a few million years ago. "I wonder if that old thing is still alive?" The ghost emperor frowned and sighed. "Whether he's alive or not, we have to give it a try." Tian nodded. He really wanted to know where that person was. "Then let's go to the underworld." The ghost emperor fell silent for a long time before saying, "Perhaps we'll find something special on this trip." Underworld? Tian was stunned. He did not expect the sacred world to have such a strange name. Tian did not waste any time. He gave Lan Zhuing a simple explanation before the two of them prepared to go to the underworld. Lan Zhuing was very calm. She did not think that she could find the person who could remove the brand of bliss. However, she was into the unbounded sacred world anyway, so she did not care which sacred world they went in next. 3 days later, Tian and Lan Zhuing arrived at the net of the sacred world in the unbounded sacred world. Because Tian had offended the people from the Heaven Dao sacred pavilion, he hid in the 9 extremities in order to not cause any unnecessary trouble. He let Lan Zhuing enter the net of the sacred world alone. At the entrance of the net of the sacred world, a guard looked at Lan Zhuing and asked in a cold manner, "Where are we going?" "The underworld," Lan Zhuing replied calmly. "The underworld?" The guard was stunned and seemed very surprised. He smiled and said, "Little girl, do you know what kind of place the underworld is?" "How much?" Lan Zhuing clearly did not want to waste time with this person and asked directly, "Little girl, the underworld is a sacred world that has not been explored yet. Its level is not fixed. The price will be doubled if you go there." The guard sneered and said, "Also, I have to remind you that the underworld is a very dangerous place. A little girl like you will not even be left after half a day." "Thank you for the reminder," Lan Zhuing said in a deep voice. She was still as cold as before. Then, she directly entered the formation after paying the money. Under the guidance of a cultivator, she entered a space-time tunnel and quickly disappeared. Sigh, such a beautiful little girl. Why can't she get over it? Why must she go to a place like the underworld? The old monsters, they're all ruthless people who eat people without spitting out their bones. The guard looked at the place where Lan Zhuing disappeared and shook his head. He seemed to feel that it was a pity. The underworld was a forbidden sacred world in the entire sacred world. Under normal circumstances, no one was willing to enter the underworld.